I stood at my own wedding reception, watching my mother grab the microphone without permission. What came next, I'd replay in my mind for years, though, not for the reason she intended. "Everyone needs to know," she announced to 200 stunned guests. "This selfish girl ruined our family vacation. We told her we had plans, but she picked this date anyway." My sister smirked from her table. My father looked away. And the room, my friends, my colleagues, people who'd driven hours to celebrate me went completely silent. For 32 years, I'd been the invisible daughter, the one who didn't matter, the one whose dreams were buried so theirs could breathe. They had no idea that I'd spent the last decade building something they couldn't touch, that every cruel word had been carefully documented, that the beautiful resort they'd kept on our fridge for 25 years dreaming about, but never reaching, I'd bought it. And I was about to tell them. I walked to that microphone with a smile they'd never seen before. What happened next would be called the wedding speech of the century by everyone who witnessed it. And trust me, my mother wished she'd stayed quiet. "My name is Tara Sanders. I'm 32 years old and I'm the chief financial officer of a boutique resort company in Chicago. On paper, my life looks like the American dream, corner office, six-figure salary, respect from colleagues who actually see me when I walk into a room. But success has a funny way of sharpening old wounds instead of healing them. And today, standing in my office with a faded photograph in my hands, I'm about to make a decision that will force my family to finally see me too. The photograph is from Christmas 1995. I've kept it in my wallet for 22 years tucked behind my credit cards, where no one would accidentally find it and ask questions I'm not ready to answer. It's torn down, the middle, jagged, deliberate, permanent. On the remaining half, you can see only a sliver of my face. One eye, half a smile, the edge of my red velvet dress. That's all that's left of 10-year-old me. The other half of the photo shows my sister Lisa perfectly centered in the frame, wearing that same smug smile she still wears today. I remember the exact moment Mum made the cut. We'd just gotten the photos back from the developer, and she was choosing which ones to frame for the mantle. I was standing right there in the kitchen, watching her sort through the stack with that critical eye she reserved for anything that didn't meet her standards of perfection. When she got to this one, the family photo in front of our Christmas tree, she paused, studied it, then reached for the scissors. "What are you doing?" I'd asked, my voice small even then. "The frame is 8 by 10, she said, not looking up. "This photo is awkward. It looks better with just Lisa centered." Just Lisa, as if I were a smudge on the lens, an overexposed edge that needed trimming. I watched those scissors slice through glossy paper, separating me from my sister, from my parents standing behind us, from the Christmas tree. With lights we'd spent all afternoon stringing, the sound of that cut-sharp final is something I've never forgotten. "There," Mum said, holding up Lisa's half with satisfaction. Perfect. I didn't cry. Even at 10, I'd already learned that crying made me dramatic and attention-seeking. So I waited until she left the kitchen, then carefully retrieved my half from the trash. I folded it small and put it in my pocket. That night, I tucked it into my diary. Years later, when I left for college, it went into my wallet. And there, it stayed a reminder of the day I learned the most important lesson of my childhood. I could disappear without anyone noticing. But people noticed me now. In boardrooms, at conferences, in the Chicago Tribune's 40 Under 40 feature last year. I've built something my parents can't diminish with scissors and dismissive words. And today, I'm about to close the deal on a resort in Mexico, a place called Casa Esperanza. My mother has never heard me mention it, but she'd recognize the name instantly. She should. She's kept a faded brochure of it pinned to our refrigerator. For 25 years, a monument to dreams she never achieved. I slip the photograph back into my wallet and check my reflection in the office window. Tailored navy suit, hair pulled back in a neat bun. The face of someone who's learned to take up space unapologetically. My phone buzzes with a text from Mark. My fiancé, knock him dead at the meeting. Love you. I smile, then head toward the conference room where Jose Martinez, the owner of Casa Esperanza, is waiting to sign the papers that will make me the new owner. That photograph taught me I could disappear without anyone noticing. But today, I'd become impossible to ignore. Becoming impossible to ignore didn't happen overnight. It took years of deliberate reinvention of building myself into someone my family couldn't dismiss with a wave of their hand. But understanding why I needed to become that person, that requires going back to the beginning, to the blueprint of invisibility that was drawn long before that Christmas photo. My sister, Lisa, is 4 years older than me, which meant she had a head start on claiming every bit of oxygen in our household. By the time I arrived, the family narrative was already written. Lisa was the golden child, the one destined for greatness, the daughter who made our parents' sacrifices worthwhile. She had our mother's delicate features and our father's easy charm. I had neither. I was sturdy where she was willowy, serious where she was effervescent, practical where she was creative. And in my mother's eyes, these weren't just differences, they were deficiencies. Lisa was beautiful in that effortless way that makes people want to smooth things over for you to make your life easier, simply because you grace it with your presence. She had honey-coloured hair that fell in natural waves, the kind women pay hundreds of dollars to replicate in salons. She had our mother's green eyes and high cheekbones. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When I walked in behind her, people's eyes slid past me to see if anyone more interesting was coming through the door. But beauty was only part of Lisa's armour. She was also smart, or at least that's what everyone believed. She won the 8th grade essay contest with a piece about overcoming adversity that made the local newspaper. Our mother framed the article and hung it in the hallway where every visitor would see it. For weeks, I heard her tell the story to anyone who'd listen, how Lisa had such a gift with words, how the judges were moved to tears, how they'd said she had a future in journalism or literature. I was in 6th grade when that happened, and I'd recently developed an obsession with the library. I'd spend hours there after school hiding in the biography section where no one looked for me. One afternoon, I pulled a book off the shelf, a collection of essays by famous writers, and started reading. 3 pages in, I froze. The words on the page were identical to my sister's award-winning essay. Not similar, identical. She'd copied it word for word, only changing the personal anecdote to make it sound like her own experience. I went home that day with the book hidden in my backpack, my heart pounding with something I couldn't name. It wasn't quite triumph, but it was close. For once I had proof that Lisa wasn't perfect, that the pedestal our parents had built for her was standing on sand. I waited until after dinner when Mum was in her favourite chair with her crossword puzzle and I brought her the book. "Mum, I need to show you something," I said, opening to the marked page. She glanced up, already irritated by the interruption. "What is it, Tara? I'm in the middle of this." "It's about Lisa's essay, the one that won the contest." I held out the book, my finger pointing to the paragraph that matched my sister's opening. "She copied it. The whole thing. It's plagiarism." My mother's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like anger. But the anger wasn't directed where I'd expected. "You're accusing your sister of cheating." Her voice was cold. "You're that jealous of her success?" "I'm not jealous, I'm just..." "Mum, look at it. It's the same words. Exactly the same." She stood up and I instinctively took a step back. "Your sister worked hard on that essay. Just because you can't write as well as she can doesn't mean you get to tear her down." She took the book from my hands and closed it with a sharp snap. "I'm disappointed in you, Tara. Deeply disappointed. This kind of petty jealousy is ugly." "But Mom..." "Enough." She handed the book back to me. "I don't want to hear another word about this. Your sister is talented and creative, and she doesn't deserve to have her own sister lying about her." I stood there, the book heavy in my hands, understanding blooming in my chest like a bruise. It didn't matter that I was telling the truth. It didn't matter that I had proof. What mattered was the story my mother had already decided to believe. And in that story, Lisa was the hero, and I was the villain, motivated by jealousy. That's when I learned the fundamental rule of our family truth didn't matter when you were already invisible. The pattern repeated itself throughout our childhood. When Lisa forgot to do her chores, Mum would say, "Tara, just do them. Your sister has a headache." When Lisa borrowed my clothes without asking and returned them stained, Mum would say, "Don't make a fuss. Lisa is delicate. You're strong, you can handle it." That phrase became her mantra, "You're strong, you can handle it." It sounded like a compliment, but it was really code for something else. It meant I didn't deserve gentleness. It meant my needs came second, third, last. It meant I was the workhorse, not the show pony. But there was one detail I noticed that nobody else seemed to see. When my grandmother visited my mother's mother, something shifted in our house. Mum, who was usually so confident and commanding, became smaller. She laughed less. She flinched when Grandma criticised the meal or pointed out dust on the mantel. She became, for those brief visits, exactly what she'd trained me to be: invisible, accommodating, desperate not to make waves. I was too young then to understand what I was witnessing. I just knew that the grandmother who seemed so to Lisa barely acknowledged me at all, and that my mother never defended me during those visits the way she defended Lisa during every other moment of our lives. Years later, I'd understand what that meant. But at the time, I only knew that the hierarchy in our family was ironclad, and I was at the bottom. After the essay incident, I stopped trying to expose Lisa's lies. There was no point. But I didn't stop noticing them. I started keeping receipts. Keeping receipts became my religion. I documented everything in a small notebook I kept hidden under my mattress: dates, conversations, promises, broken credit, stolen. I told myself I was just recording the truth, creating a record that couldn't be gaslit away. But looking back, I think I was building evidence for a trial I didn't yet know I'd need to have. The most damning piece of evidence, though, I wouldn't discover for 14 years. I was 18 when the thick envelope from MIT arrived. I remember standing at the mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in March, my hand shaking as I tore it open right there on the sidewalk. Acceptance letters are thick. Rejection letters are thin. This one was gloriously, impossibly thick. Full scholarship, it said. Full ride to one of the best universities in the country studying mechanical engineering. I'd applied in secret, taken the SATs without telling anyone, written my essays late at night after everyone was asleep. I'd done it all alone because I knew if I told my family they'd find a way to make it about Lisa or convince me I was being unrealistic. But I'd done it. I'd earned my ticket out. I walked into the house feeling like I was floating, like gravity had finally released its hold on me. Mum was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and for once I didn't hesitate. I walked right up to her and put the letter on the counter. "I got into my team, I said. "Full scholarship. I'm going to college." She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the page. For a moment, just a flicker, I saw something cross her face. That might have been pride. Or maybe I imagined it desperate for any scrap of approval. Then, her expression settled back into that familiar, cool assessment. "That's nice, honey," she said, setting the letter down. "But you know that's not possible." The floating feeling evaporated. "What do you mean, not possible? It's a full scholarship. It won't cost you anything." "It's not about the money, Tara. It's about timing." She turned back to the stove, stirring something in a pot. "Your grandmother's health is declining. She needs care, and Lisa's already enrolled at Ohio State for journalism. We need you here. You need me here to do to be Grandma's nurse, to be part of this family." Her voice had that edge it always got when I questioned her decisions. Lisa is delicate. She can't handle the stress of caretaking while trying to succeed in school. You're strong. You can handle it. You can go to the community college here and take care of your grandmother. That's what family does. I stood there, the words tangling in my throat. Lisa was going to Ohio State to study journalism, a field she'd already proven she'd cheat her way through. Meanwhile, I was supposed to give up MIT, give up engineering, give up my one chance at escape to stay home and do the work no one else wanted to do. This isn't fair, I finally managed. Life isn't fair, Tara. The sooner you learn that, the better. She didn't even look at me. Now set the table. Your father will be home soon. I thought about fighting harder. I thought about calling MIT, about explaining the situation, about going anyway. But I was 18 and worn down from a lifetime of being told my needs didn't matter. So I set the table. And when dinner was over, I put the MIT letter in my desk drawer and tried to figure out how to kill a dream quietly. I spent the next 4 years at community college taking classes between shifts, caring for my grandmother. I changed her bedpans, administered her medications, listened to her stories about the old days when she was young and beautiful and full of potential that she'd never quite fulfilled. She rarely said my name. Sometimes she called me by my mother's name. Sometimes she didn't call me anything at all. And through it all, my mother praised Lisa's college essays, attended Lisa's campus events, helped Lisa navigate her social life and career prospects. I was simply the one who handled it. Grandma died when I was 24. By then, I transferred to a state school and was finishing my bachelor's degree in finance, not engineering, because that dream had been efficiently crushed. After the funeral, I stayed at my parents' house to help sort through Grandma's belongings. Mum was already talking about converting Grandma's room into a craft space. Dad was in the garage, avoiding the whole process, the way he avoided everything uncomfortable. I was cleaning out Mum's desk, boxing up old bills and paperwork when I found it. A large manila envelope tucked in the very back of the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of old tax returns. My name was on it. The MIT return address made my heart stop. The envelope had never been opened. My hands shook as I pulled it out. It was thick, stuffed with papers, forms, orientation information. Everything I would have needed if I'd accepted the scholarship. Everything I'd never seen. I tore it open and papers spilled across the desk. Housing applications, course selection guides, a welcome letter dated April 2003. Instructions on how to confirm my enrollment. All of it pristine, untouched, hidden. I sat there for a long time staring at what my future could have been. Then, I pulled out my phone and called MIT's admissions office. It took 3 transfers before I reached someone who could access records from 14 years ago. I'm trying to understand what happened with my application, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I was accepted in 2003 with a full scholarship, but I didn't attend. I need to know what your records show. There was typing, a long pause, more typing. It shows here that we received a phone call from a woman claiming to be you, the woman on the phone said. She stated you were declining the offer due to family circumstances and requesting to withdraw your application. Is that correct? What was the date of that call? March 28th, 2003. 2 weeks after I'd shown my mother the acceptance letter. 2 weeks during which she'd been reassuring me we'd figure something out while I agonized over the decision. 2 weeks while she systematically destroyed my future behind my back. That wasn't me, I whispered. That was my mother. I'm sorry, but our records show. I hung up. I sat in that chair surrounded by the evidence of my stolen life, and something fundamental shifted inside me. For years, I told myself that my mother simply didn't understand how much she was asking of me. That she was overwhelmed and thoughtless, not deliberately cruel. That it was neglect, not malice. But you don't hide an acceptance letter for 14 years by accident. You don't impersonate your daughter and decline a scholarship on her behalf because you're overwhelmed. She didn't just hide the letter. She called MIT and slammed the door shut herself. That's when I stopped calling it love. Stopping calling it love didn't make leaving any easier. It took me 6 more months after finding that envelope to actually pack my bags and go. 6 months of sleeping in that house, eating dinners with the woman who'd stolen my future, pretending everything was normal because I didn't know how to do anything else. But the day I finished my finance degree from State, I applied to every entry-level position in Chicago I could find. I chose Chicago because it was far enough away that my mother couldn't just drop by, but close enough that I couldn't use distance as an excuse not to leave. When a small investment firm offered me an assistant position, I took it without negotiation. 3 weeks later, I loaded everything I owned into my 10-year-old Honda and drove away from Ohio without looking back. Chicago felt like a different planet. The buildings were taller, the people moved faster, and nobody knew I was supposed to be invisible. For the first month, I felt like I was playing dress-up, like someone would eventually figure out I didn't belong in these conference rooms with their glass walls and ergonomic chairs. But I showed up every day, did my work, and waited for my real life to start. Then I met Mrs. Eleanor Brennan. She was the senior account manager, a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair she wore in a tight bun and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She had a corner office and a reputation for being demanding, but fair. When my supervisor told me I'd be supporting Mrs. Brennan directly, I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. A successful woman, I thought. Someone who could mentor me. Someone who'd made it in a world that didn't always make space for women. I was naive. The first week was fine. She gave me straightforward tasks, organising files, preparing reports, scheduling meetings. I completed everything efficiently, double-checking my work the way I'd learnt to do when any mistake could be used as evidence of my inadequacy. But the second week, something shifted. She started giving me assignments with impossible deadlines, then acting surprised when I asked for clarification. I need the Henderson portfolio analysis by end of day, she'd say at 4 p.m, handing me a stack of documents 3 inches thick. Today, that's usually a 2-day project. Are you saying you can't handle it? Her voice would go cold. I was told you were capable. So I'd stay until midnight surviving on vending machine coffee and adrenaline and deliver the analysis by 8 the next morning. She'd glance at it for 30 seconds and say, "This will do, I suppose," in a tone that suggested it absolutely would not do. The pattern escalated. She began criticising my work in front of other colleagues, calling me into her office to point out minor formatting errors while her door stayed conspicuously open so everyone could hear. She'd send me to retrieve documents from storage right before important meetings I was supposed to attend, ensuring I'd miss the crucial discussions. She'd schedule calls during my lunch break and act offended when I had to reschedule. It was my mother all over again, just in a different uniform. The worst part wasn't the impossible standards or the public humiliation. It was the way she'd be perfectly pleasant to everyone else. She'd laugh at their jokes, remember their birthdays, ask about their weekends. But when she looked at me, her eyes went flat. It was like she'd decided from the moment she met me that I was the person she could safely diminish, and nothing I did would change her mind. 3 months in, I was seriously considering quitting. I'd survived my family for 24 years. Surely I could find another job where I wasn't someone's emotional punching bag. I was updating my resume one evening when Jenna Chen, one of the junior analysts, stopped by my desk. "Working late again?" she asked. "Brennan needs this reconciliation report redone. 3rd time." I didn't look up from my screen. Jenna pulled up a chair and sat down uninvited. "Can I tell you something?" She did the same thing to the last 2 assistants. Both of them quit within 4 months. I finally looked at her. So, I should quit too. I'm saying she targets people she thinks won't fight back. Jenna leaned forward. "Look, I don't know your story and you don't have to tell me. But I've watched you for 3 months. You do excellent work. You're always here early, you stay late, you never complain. And she treats you like garbage because she can, because you let her." "I don't let her," I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice. "I just do my job." "Exactly. You do your job perfectly and you accept her abuse as part of the package. That's letting her." Jenna stood up. "If you quit every time someone erases you, you'll stay invisible forever. At some point, you have to decide you matter enough to fight back." She left me sitting there, her words echoing in my head. Stay invisible forever. Isn't that exactly what I'd been doing? I'd left Ohio, but I'd brought all my old patterns with me. The belief that if I just worked hard enough, was good enough, quiet enough, someone would finally see my value and treat me accordingly. But Mrs. Brennan saw me perfectly clearly. She'd identified me as someone who'd absorbed too many years of being told my needs didn't matter, and she was exploiting that vulnerability with surgical precision. The next morning, when she criticised my work in the weekly staff meeting, I did something I'd never done before. I responded, "Actually, Mrs. Brennan, that report follows the exact specifications you provided in your email last Monday. I'd be happy to pull up the thread if there was confusion about the parameters." The room went silent. She stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Are you contradicting me? I'm clarifying the record." My heart was hammering, but my voice stayed level. "I want to make sure we're all working from the same information." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or anger. I couldn't tell, but for the first time since I started working for her, she backed down. "Fine, moving on." It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next 3 months, I kept pushing back. Politely, professionally, but consistently. When she gave me impossible deadlines, I'd say, "I can have that done by Thursday," or "I can rush it for tomorrow and the quality will suffer. Which would you prefer?" When she criticised my work publicly, I'd email her the documentation proving I'd followed her instructions exactly. I stopped absorbing her criticism as truth and started treating it as data to be evaluated. And then, 6 months after I'd started, Mrs. Brennan was escorted out of the building by security. Turned out, she'd been padding her expense reports for years, billing personal purchases to client accounts. Someone in accounting had finally noticed the pattern and reported it. 3 days later, my supervisor called me into his office and offered me Mrs. Brennan's position. I learned silence wasn't strength, it was surrender. And I was done surrendering. Being done surrendering turned out to be the best career decision I ever made. Once I stopped accepting mistreatment as the price of employment opportunities opened up in ways I'd never imagined. I moved from Mrs. Brennan's position to senior analyst within 18 months, then to finance director 2 years after that. I changed companies twice, each time negotiating higher salaries and better titles, learning that my value wasn't determined by how much abuse I could quietly absorb, but by how much expertise I could confidently deliver. 8 years after leaving Mrs. Brennan's office, I became the chief financial officer of ME Resorts, a boutique hospitality company specialising in high-end, intimate properties in exclusive locations. I was 32 years old, earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible, living in a Lincoln Park apartment with lake views and dating a kind architect named Mark, who actually seemed to enjoy my company. On paper, I was everything my parents had claimed was impossible for me to become. They had no idea. I'd kept my professional success carefully hidden from my family, maintaining the bare minimum of contact required to avoid outright estrangement. I'd call on holidays, keep conversations brief and surface level, deflect questions about my life with vague answers about working in finance and doing fine. My mother still introduced me to people as our younger daughter who lives in Chicago, with that particular emphasis that suggested living in Chicago was my only accomplishment worth mentioning. Lisa, meanwhile, had bounced between journalism jobs, gotten married and divorced, and was currently working as a freelance content writer while living in our parents' basement. But when Mum talked about us, you'd think Lisa was running the New York Times and I was barely scraping by. I'd made peace with their perception of me. Or rather, I'd stopped caring about correcting it, let them think what they wanted. My bank account and my job title knew the truth, and that was enough. Until the Monday morning meeting when Robert Chen, our CEO, pulled up the acquisition presentation. "We've been in negotiations for 3 months," he said, clicking to the first slide. "The owner is ready to retire, and the property has strong bones. It needs some modernization, but the location is perfect, and the brand identity aligns with our values. I think this could be our flagship Latin American property." The slide showed a white stucco building with terracotta roof tiles, surrounded by palm trees and overlooking turquoise water. The name across the top of the page made my breath catch Casa Esperanza. I knew that name. I'd known it for 25 years. My mother had kept a brochure for Casa Esperanza pinned to our refrigerator for as long as I could remember. It appeared yellow when I was around 7, tacked up next to the grocery list and the school calendar. The brochure showed the same white building, though the photo was grainier, more saturated with the colour tones of the 90s. "Casa Esperanza, where dreams find home." The tagline read in cheerful script across the top. I remembered asking Mum about it once when I was maybe 10, reaching up to touch the glossy paper while she made dinner. "That's where we're going to go someday," she'd said, not looking away from the onions she was chopping. "When we're successful, when your father gets his promotion, when we can afford it, someday." The brochure stayed pinned through Dad's promotion that never came through Lisa's expensive college years, and subsequent unemployment through Grandma's decline and death. It yellowed at the edges, the corners curling up from decades of steam and cooking grease. The colours faded until the turquoise water looked more grey, the white building more beige. But Mum never took it down. It became part of the kitchen landscape, as permanent and overlooked as the crack in the ceiling tile or the loose handle on the drawer that no one ever fixed. "Someday, when we're successful, we'll go to Casa Esperanza," became one of those family refrains that you heard so often it stopped meaning anything. Dad would say it when he didn't get a raise. Mum would say it when she was paying bills and sighing over the checkbook. It was shorthand for when our real life starts, for when we finally become the people we're supposed to be. They never went. Someday never came. The last time I'd been in that kitchen 2 years ago for a brief Christmas visit, the brochure was still there. More brown than white by then, held up by a piece of yellow tape that had probably been there longer than some of my colleagues had been alive. I'd stared at it while Mum complained about Lisa's car troubles, and Dad read the paper in silence. A monument to dreams deferred so long they'd fossilised into wallpaper. And now, here it was, spinning slowly on the projection screen in our conference room in downtown Chicago. No longer a faded dream, but a concrete business opportunity. "Tara, you've been quiet," Robert said, pulling me back to the present. "What's your initial assessment from a financial perspective?" I looked at the numbers on the screen. Purchase price, projected renovation costs, expected revenue streams. It was a solid investment. The property had been family-owned for 40 years, well-maintained but outdated. The location was pristine, the market underserved. With proper management and modern amenities, it could be extremely profitable. "It's a good opportunity," I heard myself say. "The numbers work, we should move forward." What I didn't say was that I was already calculating something else entirely. Me Resorts was a private company, and I'd been building my own investment portfolio for years. I had the resources to make a competing offer, a personal offer, the kind of offer that wouldn't go through corporate channels or board approvals. After the meeting, I went back to my office and pulled up the acquisition file. I read every page, memorized every detail. Then, I opened my own banking records and started running calculations. It would require liquidating some investments, taking out a substantial personal loan, but it was doable. Barely, but doable. That yellowed brochure had been my mother's someday for 25 years. A dream she'd talked about constantly, but never pursued a goal that stayed perpetually out of reach, because reaching for it would require more effort than pinning it to a refrigerator and sighing wistfully. I pulled the torn photograph from my wallet and set it on my desk next to the acquisition summary. Half a face, half a smile, half a childhood, and a whole resort that represented everything my parents had wanted but never achieved. They spent 25 years dreaming. I spent 8 years building, and now there someday would have my name on it. Having my name on something my parents had only dreamed about felt like justice, but I'd been building my life around what they didn't achieve long before that opportunity arose. Every promotion, every achievement had been constructed in opposition to their low expectations. I was successful at them, not for myself. I didn't recognise that distinction until Mark Chen pointed it out. I met Mark 6 months earlier when ME Resorts hired his architecture firm for a renovation project. Our first meeting was in the third-floor conference room. I arrived early and took my usual seat in the corner, back to the wall, where I could see both the door and windows. When Mark walked in, he paused after shaking my hand. "You always sit there?" he asked, gesturing to my corner seat. "Excuse me, in the corner, back to the wall. I noticed you sat the same way at last month's all-hands meeting." He sat to my right, not at the head of the table. "I do the same thing, actually. Corners feel safer." Over the next few weeks, Mark noticed other things. I didn't take dessert at meetings. I apologised before asking questions. I flinched when Robert complimented my work. "You act like someone who spent a long time being told to take up less space," he said during our third meeting. "And I'm wondering why someone as competent as you would believe that." "I don't believe that," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "You're the CFO of a successful company. You're brilliant with numbers and strategy. But you sit in corners, you don't take dessert even when you want it, and you apologise for existing." He leaned back. "You're not invisible. Everyone else is just blind." Something cracked open in my chest. When he asked if he could buy me dinner, I should have said no. But there was something about the way he'd truly seen me that made me say yes instead. That dinner turned into more. Mark told me about his family in San Francisco. Old money, older expectations. His grandfather built a commercial real estate empire and assumed Mark would design strip malls under the family firm. When Mark chose museums and community spaces instead, his father called him selfish. When he took a job in Chicago, his mother stopped speaking to him for 2 years. "They still introduce me as their son who's wasting his education," he said one afternoon by the lake. "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Not for a second. I'd rather be rejected for who I am than accepted for who they wanted me to be." He looked at me intently. "What about you, Tara? What do you want? Not what your company wants, not what anyone else wants. What do you want?" The question landed like a physical blow. I had no answer. Want had never been part of my vocabulary. I'd spent my life calculating what others needed from me, what I had to achieve to prove I wasn't worthless. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've never really thought about it." "You've spent so long fighting to be seen that you forgot to figure out who you want to be once people are actually looking," he said gently. "I'll wait while you figure it out." Several months later, when Mark began hinting at a more permanent future, the question of what I wanted became urgent. Would I invite my family to a wedding? The anxiety drove me to Patricia Okonkwo's office. "Mark thinks I should talk to someone." I started, then corrected myself. "I think it might be helpful. If we got married, would I invite my family? I haven't been home in 2 years. We talk maybe twice a year. My mother doesn't know what I really do for a living. And I've let them think I'm barely making ends meet because it's easier than disrupting the peace." "Is that what the silence has given you?" Dr. Okonkwo asked. "Peace." I thought about the minimal phone calls, the carefully maintained walls. It's better than fighting. When you stay quiet about your accomplishments, when you maintain this distance, does that feel peaceful inside you? It didn't. It felt like walking on ice, like constantly monitoring myself. "It feels like work," I admitted. Why stay silent when they hurt you? Because speaking up would make me like them, loud, dramatic, selfish. My mother used to say that any time I tried to stand up for myself, so I stopped being a problem. And what did that cost you? Everything. MIT, my 20s, the chance to be someone's daughter instead of someone's servant. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward. Tara's silence isn't peace, it's surrender. When you stop speaking your truth because you're afraid of being called dramatic, you're not keeping the peace, you're accepting someone else's definition of who you're allowed to be. You're erasing yourself to make them comfortable. But if I tell them everything they've done, I'll be just as bad as them. No, there's a fundamental difference. They hurt you to diminish you. You'd be speaking to stop disappearing. You can set boundaries and stand up for yourself without becoming abusive. But first you have to believe you have the right to be visible. I sat with that, then said slowly, maybe my mother sees herself in me and hates it. Maybe I remind her of something she doesn't want to face. Dr. Okonkwo nodded. That's her work to do, not yours. You can't fix her by disappearing. When I left, Mark was waiting at a coffee shop. How was it? He asked. She helped me see something. I've been treating silence like it's virtuous. Like being quiet and never causing problems is the same as being good. But it's not. I left understanding I'd been erasing myself to keep peace. But it was never peace, it was their control. Understanding that it was control and not peace changed everything, but understanding and acting on that understanding were two different things. I continued therapy with Dr. Okonkwo, peeling back layers of conditioning that had calcified over decades. Mark was patient through all of it, never pushing, always waiting for me to come to my own conclusions. We'd been together for over a year when he took me to Millennium Park on a cloudy April afternoon that smelled like rain. We were walking past the Bean, that giant silver sculpture that reflects the city back at itself in warped, distorted ways when the first drop started falling. Most people hurried toward cover, but Mark stopped walking. He turned to face me, rain starting to darken his jacket, and pulled a small box from his pocket. I've been trying to find the perfect moment, he said. But I don't think perfect exists, and I don't want to wait anymore. He opened the box to reveal a simple platinum band with a single small diamond. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed for attention, just honest and straightforward like him. Tara, you're the bravest person I know, even though you don't see it yet. You've built an entire life out of nothing with no support, no encouragement, no blueprint. And I want to spend the rest of my life being the person who sees you, who chooses you, who makes sure you never feel invisible again. The rain was falling harder now, and I could feel it soaking through my coat, cold against my skin. You deserve a family that chooses you, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. Let me be that family. Marry me. I said yes. Of course, I said yes. I loved him, loved the way he noticed things, loved how he'd spent a year proving that someone could see all of me and not flinch away. He slipped the ring on my finger and we kissed in the rain like people in movies do, and for a few minutes everything felt uncomplicated and right. It wasn't until we got back to my apartment, drenched and laughing, that the complications caught up with me. Mark went to make tea while I changed into dry clothes, and as I was hanging up my wet jacket, I started trembling. Not from cold, but from the sudden crushing weight of what came next. A wedding meant decisions. A wedding meant guest lists. A wedding meant I'd have to answer the question I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Would I invite my family? I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the ring on my finger. Mark called from the kitchen, asking if I wanted honey in my tea, and I tried to answer, but my throat had closed up. What would I tell them? How would I explain that I was marrying someone they'd never met, that I'd built a life they knew nothing about, and if I did invite them, what then? Would my mother find a way to make it about Lisa? Would my father stand there in uncomfortable silence while my mother criticised my choices? Would I spend my own wedding day trying to manage their feelings and expectations, shrinking? myself back down to fit their frame. The anxiety spiral was familiar territory, and I recognized it for what it was. The old pattern trying to reassert itself. I forced myself to breathe, to think practically. I needed information before I could make decisions. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I went to my closet and pulled out the box where I kept old phones and chargers, things I'd meant to recycle, but never got around to disposing of. My previous phone was in there, the one I'd used before upgrading 2 years ago. I plugged it in and waited for it to power up that old startup sound oddly loud in the quiet apartment. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly. Maybe old texts from my mother, something I could point to as evidence of her dismissiveness. Maybe photos that would remind me of why I'd left in the first place. The phone loaded slowly outdated software, struggling to catch up with itself. When it finally opened, I went straight to my messages. There were hundreds of texts from that period of my life, most of them work-related or from friends I'd since lost touch with. I scrolled backward through conversations I barely remembered having, until I reached messages from 3 years ago. And there, in a thread with Lisa, I found something that made my blood turn cold. It was from a night in January, well past midnight. I remembered that night vaguely. I'd been at my parents' house helping with Grandma, and Lisa had been out with friends. The text was short sent to me, but clearly meant for someone else, probably our mother. The kind of mistake people make when they're drunk or distracted, sending a message to the wrong person in their contacts. "Thank God, Mum made her stay," it read. "I couldn't deal with Grandma. Tara's so much better at that stuff anyway." I stared at those words until they blurred. Made her stay. Not Tara chose to stay or Tara offered to help. Made her stay. As in orchestrated it. As in deliberately manipulated the situation to trap me there. My hands were shaking as I scrolled further back, looking for more. And there they were, breadcrumbs I'd ignored at the time, messages that suddenly took on new meaning with this context. Lisa texting me, "Mom says you're staying to help with Grandma, that's so nice of you." Not asking if I was staying, stating it as fact. Another text weeks earlier. "Mom's worried about Grandma, thank God you're not going anywhere." Going anywhere to MIT. The acceptance I'd shown my mother the future that had been systematically dismantled. I thought about that text from Lisa, about the casual cruelty of it. Thank God Mum made her stay. I couldn't deal with Grandma. They'd sat around my mother and sister and decided between them that my life, my dream, my future were worth less than their convenience. It wasn't that my mother had been overwhelmed and made a desperate choice in the moment. It wasn't that she'd acted without thinking. She had conspired with Lisa, had made a deliberate plan to keep me trapped, and they'd congratulated themselves for it. All those years I'd spent telling myself it was thoughtlessness, overwhelm, lack of understanding. All that therapy working through whether I could forgive them for not knowing better. But they had known. They'd known exactly what they were taking from me, and they'd done it anyway, because it was easier than dealing with their own responsibilities. Mark came into the bedroom carrying 2 mugs of tea and stopped when he saw my face. "What's wrong?" I held up the phone, my hand still shaking. "I found something." He set down the mugs and sat beside me, and I showed him the text. Watched his expression shift from confusion to understanding to anger. "They knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't that they didn't understand what they were asking. They planned it. They made a choice to sacrifice my future for their convenience. Mark pulled me against him, and I let myself cry in a way I hadn't since finding that MIT envelope. But these tears felt different. Not grief for what I'd lost, but rage at how deliberately it had been taken. They didn't just take advantage of my silence. They conspired to keep me silent. Conspiracy requires planning, coordination, deliberate choice. For days, after finding that text, I couldn't stop thinking about the word. They'd conspired against me, had sat together, and decided my future was worth less than their comfort. The anger that came with that realization was different from anything I'd felt before. It wasn't the hot reactive rage of a moment. It was cold and clear and calculating. It was fuel. Mark wanted me to confront them immediately, to call and demand answers, but I knew that wouldn't work. Confrontation required them to care about my feelings, to value my perspective enough to engage with it. They'd spent 32 years proving they didn't. Words wouldn't change anything, but actions might. I'd been monitoring the Casa Esperanza acquisition through Me Resorts for weeks, watching the negotiations progress, seeing the timeline take shape. The company was planning to close the deal within 60 days, but real estate transactions were delicate things. A lot could happen in 60 days. A competing offer, for instance. A private buyer willing to move faster and pay slightly more. I called my financial advisor on a Wednesday morning and told him I needed to liquidate a significant portion of my investment portfolio. He asked the obvious questions about tax implications and long-term growth, and I told him I understood the risks. Then I called my bank and inquired about bridge loans for commercial property acquisition. The numbers were staggering, the kind that would have made 24-year-old me dizzy with panic. But I wasn't 24 anymore. I was the CFO of a resort company. I knew exactly how to structure these deals, and I had 8 years of excellent credit and smart investments behind me. By Friday, I had the financing arranged. By Monday, I was on a plane to Mexico. Casa Esperanza was exactly as the brochure had promised, if you could see past the dated decor and deferred maintenance. The white stucco building with its terracotta tiles sat on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by palm trees and flowering vines that had been allowed to grow wild. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more intimate. 24 rooms, a restaurant with an open-air terrace, a pool that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The kind of place that prioritized character over luxury experience, over amenities. Jose Martinez, the owner, met me in the lobby. He was 70, but moved with the energy of someone much younger, his handshake firm, his eyes sharp with intelligence. We sat in his office, which had windows overlooking the ocean, and I made my pitch. I explained that I represented myself, not a corporation, that I was prepared to offer 5% above ME Resorts' pending offer, and that I could close within 30 days if he was willing to work with my timeline. He listened without interrupting, his weathered hands folded on the desk between us. When I finished, he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he asked, "Why this property? You're very young to be buying resorts on your own. There are easier investments, more profitable opportunities." Why Casa Esperanza? I hadn't planned to tell him the truth. I'd prepared a professional answer about market positioning and growth potential. But something about the way he asked, the genuine curiosity without judgment, made me change my mind. "My mother kept a brochure of this place on our refrigerator for 25 years, I said. It was faded and curling at the edges, held up with old tape. She'd point to it and say, "Someday when we're successful, we'll go there." It became this symbol of everything they wanted but never achieved. And they never came here. Not once. The brochure stayed pinned there like a monument to their failure. Jose's expression shifted, something that might have been recognition or sadness crossing his face. "And now you want to buy what they only dreamed about." "I want to own what they convinced themselves was impossible." I met his eyes. They spent my whole life telling me I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, that my dreams were impractical and selfish. They sabotaged my education to keep me home as free labour. And then they kept this brochure on the fridge as a daily reminder of their own unfulfilled potential. So yes, I want to buy it. I want to prove that the future they claimed was out of reach was only out of their reach. He was quiet for a long moment, looking past me toward the ocean. Then he said, "My father built this resort in 1977. He was a fisherman who saved for 20 years to buy this land. Everyone in our village told him he was crazy, that tourists would never come, that he was throwing away his money. He built it anyway. Do you know what he told me when I was young?" I shook my head. He said dreams don't die when people give up on them. They just wait for someone brave enough to pick them up. Jose turned back to me. "Your mother's dream didn't die because she failed to achieve it. It was waiting for someone stronger to make it real." You're not stealing her dream. You're honoring it by achieving what she couldn't. There's a difference. His words hit me unexpectedly hard. I'd been framing this as revenge, as proof of their failure. But he was right that it was something else too. It was proof that dreams were achievable, that the excuses my parents had made for decades were just that, excuses. They could have saved money, could have made this trip, could have turned their someday into reality. They chose not to. I chose differently. I'll accept your offer, Jose said, with one condition. You keep the name. Casa Esperanza means House of Hope. I think you understand what that means better than most. We shook hands, and over the next 3 weeks, I worked with lawyers on both sides of the border to structure the purchase through a private LLC I'd created. The paperwork was complex, the due diligence exhausting, but I'd spent years managing resort finances and knew exactly what I was looking for. The property was sound, the potential enormous. Even if my family drama didn't exist, this would have been a smart investment. But the family drama did exist. And when I signed the final papers in Jose's office, on a bright Tuesday afternoon, officially becoming the owner of Casa Esperanza, I felt something shift inside me. This building, this business, this piece of coastline, it was mine, not theirs, mine. Purchased with money I'd earned, financed through credit, I'd built, executed with expertise I'd developed. Every single piece of this acquisition was proof that I was exactly what they'd claimed I could never be. The LLC structure meant my name appeared nowhere on public records. As far as anyone researching the property would know, it had been sold to an anonymous investment group. ME Resorts had been disappointed to lose the deal, but Robert had been gracious about it. Someone came in with a better offer, he told me. That's business. We'll find another property. I'd nodded sympathetically, never mentioning that the someone was me. I flew back to Chicago with the signed documents in my briefcase and a plan forming in my mind. I had the venue. I had the ring. I had the proof that I'd succeeded where they'd failed. Now I needed to set the stage for them to witness exactly what they had tried to prevent me from becoming. I didn't steal their dream. I proved I was the success they'd been waiting to become. Now I was ready to tell them about the wedding. Being ready to tell them and actually making the call were two different things. I sat in my apartment for 3 days with my phone in my hand, Mark's ring on my finger, and the Casa Esperanza deed in my desk drawer. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd stay calm when they inevitably tried to make it about themselves. Dr. Okonkwo had coached me through setting boundaries, maintaining composure, not allowing them to derail the conversation. I was as prepared as I'd ever be. I called on a Sunday afternoon when I knew they'd both be home. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that particular tone of mild annoyance she always had when I called. Tara, this is unexpected. Hi, Mum. I have some news. I'm getting married. There was a pause longer than necessary. Married to whom? His name is Mark. He's an architect. We've been together for over a year and he proposed last month. We're planning the wedding for March 15th. I kept my voice steady, factual. I wanted to let you know well in advance. That's 8 months away, so you'll have plenty of time to make arrangements if you'd like to come. Another pause. I could hear her breathing, could imagine her face doing those calculations. She always did when presented with information about me trying to figure out how to minimize it or redirect attention. March 15th, she repeated. That's very sudden. 8 months isn't sudden, Mum. That's why I'm calling now. Well, we'll have to see if we can fit it in. Your father and I have been planning something for quite a while now. Her voice took on that martyred quality I knew so well. We've been saving for a vacation. We're going to Casa Esperanza in Mexico. We finally decided to treat ourselves after all these years. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice neutral. Casa Esperanza. When are you planning to go? March 10th through the 20th. We've been looking at dates. She said it with absolute certainty, as if the plans were already finalised. So you see, the timing is unfortunate. You'll need to change your date. I looked down at the ring on my finger, thought about the deed in my drawer, and felt something that might have been amusement. Have you booked it yet? Well, not officially, but we're going to. That's our week. We've been dreaming about this for 25 years, Tara. Surely you can pick a different date for your wedding. So you haven't actually booked anything? We will. The resort is very popular, I'm sure. We need that specific week because of your father's work schedule. Her voice hardened. You're being selfish, as usual. This is exactly like you picking a date without considering anyone else. I almost laughed. Almost told her right then that she couldn't book Casa Esperanza for that week or any week without my permission because I owned every single day on that calendar. But I caught myself. The reveal would be so much sweeter in person with witnesses. I'll keep the date I've chosen, Mum. March 15th. I hope you can make it. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking not from upset, but from the effort of holding back the truth. Mark came into the room and saw my face. That bad... Actually, I said it was perfect. She walked right into exactly the trap I'd hoped for. She claimed it was their week. She had no idea I owned every single day on that calendar. I thought that was the end of it, for now that I'd given them 8 months to stew in their resentment before the actual confrontation. But 2 days later, Robert called me into his office with an expression I'd never seen before, confused and slightly angry. I need to ask you something, he said, gesturing for me to close the door. And I need you to be completely honest with me. My stomach dropped. Of course. Do you owe anyone in your family money? The question was so unexpected that I actually laughed. No. Why? Because I received a very concerning email this morning from someone claiming to be a debt collector. They said you owe your family $50,000 and have been dodging repayment. They suggested we might want to reconsider our trust in you given your questionable financial ethics. He slid a printed email across the desk. I also received a phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your sister, expressing concern about your instability and money problems. I picked up the email, my hands starting to shake again, but this time from rage. The email was professionally formatted, used legal-sounding language, and was completely fabricated. This is a lie, all of it. I don't owe my family anything. In fact, I stopped myself. Robert, I don't know how to say this without sounding paranoid, but I think my sister is trying to sabotage me. That was my first thought too. He leaned back in his chair, which is why I had it trace the IP address of the email and the phone number from the call. Both came from the same location in Ohio. He pulled up something on his computer and turned the screen toward me. This address mean anything to you? It was my parents' house, Lisa's current address since she'd moved back into their basement. That's where my sister lives. I felt cold. She's actively trying to destroy my professional reputation. Robert nodded slowly. I figured. For what it's worth, I didn't believe any of it. I've worked with you for 4 years. I know your character and I know your financial acumen, but I needed to confirm. He paused. Why would your sister do this? Because I'm getting married and I didn't tell them I'm successful. Because I've been letting them think I'm barely scraping by and now they're finding out I have an actual life they weren't invited to control. I set the email down. I found a text on my old phone recently. My sister, thanking our mother for making me stay to take care of our grandmother. They conspired to trap me at home, to sabotage my MIT scholarship. And now I'm building a life without them, and she can't stand it. Jesus, Robert said quietly. He told me once about his own family cutting him off when he started his company, instead of joining his father's firm. He understood this particular kind of betrayal. What do you want to do about it? Can you flag the email as spam and block the number? Already done, but Tara, this is harassment. potentially even criminal depending on how far she takes it. I know, but I don't want to deal with lawyers and police reports right now. I met his eyes. I want to handle this my way, and I need you to trust me on that. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. I trust you. But if it escalates, we're documenting everything. I won't let someone damage your career because they're jealous. I left his office feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. I'd known my family was dismissive, neglectful, even cruel in their selfishness. But this was different. This was Lisa actively trying to destroy my livelihood, to poison my professional relationships, to dismantle everything I'd built. She wasn't just taking advantage of my silence anymore. She was trying to ensure I stayed silent by eliminating my ability to succeed. Mark called during my lunch break and I told him everything. When I finished, there was a long silence on his end. Tara, he finally said, you need to cut them off completely. This isn't family drama anymore. This is abuse. I know, but I'm not cutting them off yet. Not until after the wedding. I looked out my office window at the Chicago skyline, at all the evidence of my success that they'd tried so hard to prevent. I need them to see what I've become first. I need them to understand exactly what they failed to destroy, and then I'll decide if they're worth keeping in my life at all. That evening, I sat at my desk and pulled out the notebook I'd been keeping since high school. The receipts, as I'd always called them, dates and quotes and evidence of every betrayal. I'd been documenting for 15 years without really knowing why. Now I understood. I'd been building a case. I added 2 new entries. Mum claimed Casa Esperanza Week as theirs without knowing I own it, and Lisa sent forged debt collector email to Robert attempting professional sabotage. Robert had asked me earlier who would hate me enough to do something like this. I answered simply, my family. And I realised they didn't just want me invisible. They wanted me destroyed. Wanting me destroyed was clarifying in a way that mere dismissiveness had never been. For years, I told myself they simply didn't think about me, that I was background noise in their lives easily overlooked. But you don't actively sabotage someone you've forgotten about. You don't forge emails and make phone calls to ruin someone's career unless you're threatened by their existence. Lisa's attack meant I'd become visible enough to be dangerous to her, and that realization shifted something fundamental in how I understood our relationship. Mark wanted me to elope. He brought it up that night over takeout Chinese food, that neither of us was really eating his fortune cookie untouched on the table between us. We could go to the courthouse tomorrow, he said. Just us 2 witnesses done. No drama, no guest list anxiety, no wedding planning stress. We get married, and your family never gets the chance to ruin another important moment in your life. I pushed lo mein around my plate considering it. The idea was appealing in its simplicity. Just walk away, cut them off completely, live my life without their shadow hanging over it. I'd been walking away from conflict my entire life. It was my primary survival strategy honed through decades of practice. I can't, I finally said. Why not give me one good reason why we should give them any more power over our lives? Because I've walked away my whole life. From confrontation, from standing up for myself, from demanding to be seen. And every time I walked away, I told myself it was strength that being the bigger person meant absorbing their cruelty silently. I set down my fork. But it wasn't strength. It was just another way of disappearing. And I'm done disappearing. Mark reached across the table and took my hand. I understand wanting to confront them, but at what cost? They've already tried to sabotage your career. What's next? I don't know, but whatever it is, I'm not going to let the fear of it control my choices anymore. I squeezed his hand. I need to do this, not for them, for me. I need to stand up and be seen, and I need them to know that all their efforts to keep me small failed. He was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, but We do this smart. We document everything, we prepare for every possible move they might make, and we protect ourselves legally if we need to. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. At the top of one page, I wrote, "If I do, nothing." At the top of the facing page, I wrote, "If I stand up." Then I started filling in the columns. Under "if I do, nothing," I wrote, "They win." The pattern continues. Lisa faces no consequences for sabotage. I carry this silence for the rest of my life. My children grow up never knowing why we don't see my family. I prove them right that I'm too weak to matter. Under "if I stand up," I wrote, "I risk becoming like them, cruel, vindictive, destructive. They may escalate further. Other family members might take sides. I might lose relationships I haven't considered. But I finally get to exist in full sentences instead of apologetic fragments. My children see someone who fought for her right to be seen. I proved to myself that silence wasn't strength, it was surrender. I stared at those lists for over an hour, reading and rereading, adding notes in the margins. The risks of standing up were real and significant. But the cost of doing nothing was the rest of my life spent small quiet erased, and I'd already paid that cost for 32 years. I was done paying it. I pulled out a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Rules for standing up without becoming them." Number 1, I will tell only the truth. No exaggerations, no embellishments, no invented grievances. The facts are damning enough. Number 2, I will not humiliate them for entertainment. This is about being seen, not about revenge. Number 3, I will offer them grace if they're capable of receiving it. But I won't sacrifice myself for their comfort. Number 4, I will remember that their cruelty came from their own damage. Understanding doesn't excuse, but it prevents me from becoming what they are. Number 5, I will do this for myself, not to hurt them. The moment it becomes about vengeance, I've lost. I looked at those rules and realised they were also a definition of who I wanted to be. Not cruel, not vindictive, not performing hurt for an audience, just visible, just real, just finally, undeniably present. The next morning, I started building my case. I pulled my bank records for the past 6 years and highlighted every mortgage payment I'd made to my parents' lender through the anonymous LLC I'd set up. The payments were consistent on time never missed, $18,000 312 times. $180,000 total that I'd quietly funneled into keeping them housed while they called me a failure. I printed out the MIT letter I'd found in my mother's desk, the one that had never been opened along with the housing application, and course selection guides that had arrived weeks later, also unopened. I called MIT again and requested written confirmation of the phone call my mother had made in 2003, declining my acceptance on my behalf. They sent me an official record within 3 days. I screenshotted the text from Lisa, "Thank God Mum made her stay," and saved it in 3 separate places. I printed out the forged debt collector email she'd sent to Robert, along with the IT department's report tracing it back to my parents' address. I documented the date and content of my mother's phone call about the wedding, her claim to their week at Casa Esperanza, her demand that I change my date. Each piece of evidence went into a folder, organised chronologically, labelled clearly. This wasn't a scrapbook of resentments. It was a legal quality documentation of a pattern of sabotage that had lasted my entire life. If they tried to claim I was being dramatic, exaggerating, imagining slights that never happened, I had proof. Irrefutable, time-stamped, independently verified proof. Dr. Okonkwo had asked me once what I was afraid would happen if I stood up to them. "I'm afraid I'll become cruel like them," I'd said. "I'm afraid anger will turn me into someone I don't recognise." "Anger isn't the problem," she'd replied. "It's what you do with it that matters." You can use it to destroy, or you can use it as fuel to build boundaries. The choice is always yours. I looked at the folder of evidence on my desk, at the careful documentation of truth without embellishment, at the rules I'd written for myself to stay human through this process. I'd spent weeks preparing for this confrontation, and not once had I invented a grievance or exaggerated a hurt. I hadn't needed to. The truth was devastating enough. Mark came into the kitchen and saw me surrounded by papers that folded thick with documentation sitting in the centre of the table like evidence at a trial. "What's all this?" he asked. "Insurance," I said, "in case they try to rewrite history, in case they claim I'm lying or exaggerating or being dramatic. This is proof. This is what actually happened, documented and verifiable." He picked up the mighty letter, read it, set it down carefully. "You're really doing this?" "I am, but not the way they would. I'm not planning revenge." I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning justice. And there's a difference. The difference between justice and revenge occupied my thoughts constantly in those weeks. Revenge would have been easy leak to my mother that I owned the resort watch, her panic. But that would be about inflicting pain. Justice required precision and giving them enough rope to hang themselves. I didn't need to manufacture their cruelty. I just needed to let them be themselves while someone watched. I'd been in regular contact with Carmen Rodriguez, the general manager at Casa Esperanza. She was 53, had worked there 20 years, and had been relieved when I assured her I wouldn't replace her. I'd given her a raise and more autonomy, asking only that she keep my ownership confidential and alert me to any unusual booking requests. "I have family drama that might spill over," I told her during our first video call. "Follow standard protocols exactly. If anyone claiming to be related to me tries to make changes or requests special treatment, I need to know immediately." Carmen understood. "Treat them like any other guests. No special access." "Exactly, and document everything." 3 weeks after calling my mother about the wedding, that system proved its worth. I was in a budget meeting when my phone buzzed with an alert. "Attempted booking modification. Owner alert." I waited until the meeting ended, then called Carmen from an empty conference room. "Tell me what happened," I said. "We received a call an hour ago from a woman identifying herself as Mrs. Sandra Sanders, mother of the bride. She said she needed to update the wedding booking for March 15th. "Update how?" She didn't specify at first. Asked to confirm reservation details which felt wrong. Why wouldn't the mother know the details? So I followed protocol. I said I'd be happy to help but needed written authorization from you. Her response? Defensive. Said that wasn't necessary, that she was your mother, and you'd asked her to handle this. Then she said, quote, "My daughter is very busy with work and can be a bit unreliable with these things. I'm just trying to help." My jaw tightened. Unreliable. The same word Lisa used with Robert. This was coordinated strategy. "What did you tell her?" "That Casa Esperanza has strict privacy policies. We cannot modify bookings without written authorization from the guest who made the original reservation." She got insistent, said she just needed to check a few dates and adjust the guest list. I repeated the policy. She asked for my manager. "And you said that I am the manager and the policy comes from ownership." She became rude, said she'd been planning to stay here for 25 years, that we should be grateful for her business. Then she said something interesting. "I'll just book my own reservation for that week. We were coming anyway." There it was. My mother couldn't cancel my wedding directly, so she'd book herself into the resort during my wedding, ensuring she'd be there whether I wanted her or not. Creating disruption until staff suggested I move my event to keep the peace. Manipulative, controlling, entirely predictable. "What did you tell her?" "That we'd check availability. I took her contact information. She wanted March 10th through 20th. I said I'd email within 24 hours. Carmen paused. "I'm assuming you want me to say we're fully booked." I considered it. The easy answer was yes, but that felt reactive. It didn't address the real issue, my mother's assumption she could manipulate her way into controlling my wedding. No, tell her the truth. March 10th through 20th is fully booked due to a private event, my wedding. Tell her Casa Esperanza policy doesn't accept bookings from family members of event hosts during private events to maintain boundaries and avoid conflicts of interest. We're officially denying the booking based on her relationship to you. Exactly. And Carmen flag her name in the system. Sandra and Richard vendors are not permitted to make reservations at Casa Esperanza at any time without my explicit written approval. Not for my wedding week, not ever. If they call again, the answer is no. Brief silence. You're blacklisting your own parents. I'm protecting my wedding from people who've made clear they'll sabotage it if given the opportunity. They called pretending to have authority they don't have, lied about me being unreliable and tried to manipulate your staff. That's not family drama. That's deliberate sabotage. Understood. I'll send the email today. Anyone else I should flag? I thought about Lisa's forged emails. Lisa Sanders, same restrictions, and note that any caller claiming to be family or speaking on my behalf should be verified directly with me before releasing information or making changes. Consider it done. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Thank you. But honestly, I'd rather know exactly who they are and plan accordingly than be caught off guard. I ended the call and sat in the quiet conference room, processing what had happened. My mother had called my wedding venue, lied to staff, implied I was incompetent, and tried to force her way into my wedding week. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was calculated manipulation. The same pattern my entire life, but now with my wedding as the battlefield. I pulled up the reservation system and navigated to booking management. There was Carmen's incident report in the alert queue. I read every detail, every exact quote. Then I opened guest restrictions and entered my parents' names. The system prompted reason for restriction. I typed guest has demonstrated pattern of attempting to manipulate staff and circumvent protocols. Has made false claims about authority and reliability of other guests. Denied future booking privileges by owner directive. I clicked save. Their names turned red, marked as restricted. A banner appeared, these guests will be automatically denied for all future booking requests. It felt surreal blacklisting my own parents, but it also felt necessary. They'd tried to steal my wedding venue, tried to manipulate their way into controlling an event they'd said they couldn't attend because of vacation plans. The hypocrisy would be laughable if it wasn't so calculated. I forwarded Carmen's report to my evidence folder, adding it to the growing documentation. Then I wrote a summary of the incident and my emotional response. Dr. Okonkwo had taught me documentation wasn't just facts. It was tracking my own reactions, ensuring decisions came from clarity rather than raw emotion. Mark texted, "How'd the meeting go?" The budget meeting was fine, but my mother just tried to hijack the wedding venue. "I'll tell you tonight." His reply was immediate. "Jesus, are you okay?" "Yeah, I handled it. She's blacklisted now." "Good. Love you?" I put my phone away and pulled up my wedding planning spreadsheet. 6 months to go. 6 months of my family trying to undermine and control. But I had something they didn't know about power. Real power, not the borrowed authority my mother tried to claim. I owned the venue. I controlled the guest list. I had documentation of every move they made. She tried to steal my wedding from under me. I clicked denied and added her to the blacklist. Let her try again. Letting them try again turned out to be exactly the right strategy, though I had to wait 4 months to see what form their next attempt would take. The silence from my family after the blacklist incident was almost worse than their active sabotage. I kept expecting another move, another escalation, but nothing came. No calls, no emails, not even the usual passive-aggressive holiday texts. It was the kind of quiet that preceded storms. 2 weeks before the wedding, Carmen called me at work with an edge in her voice I hadn't heard before. "I need to tell you about a call we just received. It was strange enough that I recorded it per your instructions. Play it for me. What I heard made my blood run cold, then hot, then cold again. It was Lisa's voice calling to confirm some details about the March 15th event. The receptionist, well trained by Carmen, had politely said she'd need to verify the caller's authorization. That's when I heard it. The muffled sound of Lisa saying to someone in the background, "Hold on, I think I'm on speaker," followed by the click of speakerphone being disabled. But for 5 seconds before that click, I heard everything. "Mom, I'm telling you, we need to do this at the wedding itself." Lisa's voice sharp with frustration. "She's been flaunting her success, pretending she's so much better than us. The investigator confirmed it, she's the CFO, she's loaded, and she's been hiding it to make us look bad." My mother's voice quieter, but just as venomous. "I still think we should just not go." "No, that's what she wants. She wants to be able to tell everyone we didn't support her. We go, and we make sure everyone there knows exactly what kind of person she is." A pause. "I wrote the speech for you. It's perfect. You'll deliver it during the toasts, very emotional, very sincere. About how she ruined our family vacation, how she's always been selfish, how hard we've tried with her." "What if she stops me?" "She won't. She'll be too shocked, and besides, it'll look worse if she makes a scene. Either way, we win." Then, the click, and Lisa's voice returning to professional politeness, with the receptionist who smoothly deflected her questions and ended the call. I sat at my desk, the recording playing through my mind on repeat. They'd hired a private investigator. They'd discovered my actual life. And, rather than feeling pride or even neutral acknowledgement, they'd decided this was an attack on them that required public retaliation. The logic was so twisted, so perfectly in character, that I almost laughed. "What do you want me to do?" Carmen asked. "Nothing. Let them come. Let them think they're going to surprise me." I pulled up my wedding timeline. In fact, make sure there's a microphone available during the reception toasts. Make it very easy for my mother to grab it if she wants to. You want her to give the speech. I want her to show everyone exactly who she is. I'm done trying to explain my family to people. Let them explain themselves. The next 2 weeks crawled by. I finalised seating charts, confirmed vendors had my final dress fitting. Mark kept asking if I was nervous, and I realised I wasn't. I was calm in a way I'd never been before a major life event. I knew what was coming. I'd prepared for it. And I was finally completely ready to stop hiding. The morning of the wedding, I woke in the owner's suite at Casa Esperanza, with sunlight streaming through white curtains and the sound of waves outside my window. Mark had stayed in a different room per tradition, though he'd texted me at dawn. "Can't wait to see you. See words. Can't wait to stand beside you. Can't wait for everyone to see what I see." My mother's voice came to me then unbidden and unwelcome from my teenage years as I'd gotten ready for junior prom. Lisa had looked stunning in her dress, and when I'd emerged in mine, Mum had studied me with that critical eye and said, "Well, you look nice. You'll never be as beautiful as Lisa was at your age, but you look nice." I'd believed her then, believed that beauty, worth and visibility were things other people granted or withheld based on their assessment of your value. I'd spent decades trying to earn the right to be seen to be beautiful to matter. I stood now in front of the full-length mirror in my wedding dress, simple, elegant, fitted perfectly to my body, not trying to be anything other than what it was. My hair was styled in soft waves, my makeup natural. I looked like myself, just elevated. Not transformed into someone else. Not trying to be Lisa. Just me. I spoke aloud to my reflection, my voice steady. "I don't need to be Lisa. I don't need to be anyone's version of enough. I am whole. I always was." The words felt true in a way that shook something loose inside my chest. I walked to the desk where I'd placed 2 photographs side by side. The first was the torn Christmas photo from 1995, that half image of 10-year-old me that had lived in my wallet for 22 years. The second was from last month, Mark and I laughing. On the beach at sunset, his arm around me, both of us whole and complete in the frame. I picked up both photos, studying them. In the first, I'd been cut to make room for Lisa's perfection. In the second, I'd chosen who stood beside me who deserved to share my frame. The difference wasn't just in the images, it was in who controlled the scissors. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Okonkwo, who I'd been seeing weekly up until yesterday. Remember, you're not waiting to be completed by their approval. You already are complete. You always were. They just couldn't see it because they were looking at you through their own brokenness. I set the photos back down side by side, a reminder of where I'd been and where I was going. Then I looked at myself in the mirror one more time, really looked, and saw what Mark saw, what my friends saw, what I was finally learning to see: a woman who'd survived systematic erasure and built herself into someone undeniable, not in spite of my family, but independent of them entirely. There was a knock at the door, Carmen's voice. "Ms. Sanders, your parents just arrived. They're asking where to put their things. Tell them to check with the front desk for their room assignments." I smoothed my dress. "And Carmen, make sure the microphone system is working perfectly for the toasts. Already tested it twice." "Good." I took one last look in the mirror. My mother's voice tried to rise again in my head. "You'll never be as beautiful," but I shut it down. That voice had controlled me for 32 years. It didn't get to control me today. I wasn't broken. I was forced into a frame too small. Today, I'd step out and show them the real picture. Stepping out of that frame meant showing people the real picture. And I decided the rehearsal dinner was the perfect place to start. It was intimate enough to feel personal, but public enough that my parents couldn't simply rewrite what happened later. 40 witnesses, including Mark's family and my closest friends, all gathered on the terrace, overlooking the Pacific as the sun set in shades of orange and pink. My parents arrived exactly on time, which should have been my first warning. My mother never arrived on time unless she was making a point. She was wearing a cream-coloured dress that was just formal enough to avoid being criticised, but casual enough to suggest she didn't think the event warranted real effort. My father trailed behind her in khakis and a blazer, his face already wearing that checked-out expression he got whenever he knew conflict was coming but didn't want to participate in it. Lisa had driven separately and arrived 10 minutes later, her entrance timed for maximum attention. She'd always known how to work a room, and she scanned the terrace with that calculating look she got when she was assessing who mattered and who didn't. They took their assigned seats at a table near the back, and I watched my mother's face when she realised she wasn't at the head table with the parents of the bride and groom. Mark's parents were their warm and gracious people who'd welcomed me, Mani, into their family without reservation. The empty seats beside them were for my parents, but I'd moved them after the venue hijack attempt. Let them sit in the back and think about why. Dinner was served, family-style platters of grilled fish and roasted vegetables, and fresh tortillas passed around each table. I'd worked with Carmen to design a menu that honoured Chose's family recipes while appealing to American palates. It was simple, fresh and delicious, and I watched most guests help themselves to seconds and thirds. Most guests. My mother picked at her fish with her fork, moving it around her plate without actually eating much. I saw her lean over to my father and whisper something. Saw him nod with that same checked-out expression. Then she flagged down one of the servers. "Excuse me, is there any butter for the fish? It's very dry." The server, a young woman named Rosa, who'd been briefed on potential difficult guests, smiled politely. "The fish is grilled with olive oil and lime, ma'am, but I can bring butter if you'd prefer." "Yes, please, and the vegetables are under-seasoned. Could you bring salt?" Rosa nodded and left. My mother sat back with a satisfied expression, having made her point that the food wasn't up to her standards. She didn't know that Rosa reported directly to Carmen, who was texting me updates from the kitchen. Your mother just sent back the fish. Want me to comp it? I texted back, no. Let her pay for what she doesn't eat. The criticism continued through dinner. The terrace was too warm, the music was too loud. The flowers were pretty, but probably wildly overpriced. Each comment was delivered just loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, just quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if called out. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive undermining, and I'd seen my mother perform it hundreds of times throughout my childhood. But this time, I'd come prepared. After dessert was served, Mark stood to give a brief welcome speech thanking everyone for travelling to celebrate with us. Then, he invited anyone who wanted to share a toast or a few words. His father went first, telling a sweet story about Mark as a boy. One of my friends from college went next, talking about how I'd helped her through a difficult time freshman year. Then, I stood up. I had my phone in my hand, which wasn't unusual at a modern rehearsal dinner, but what I pulled up on the screen was something I'd been planning for months. I want to share something before we all head off tonight. I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Most of you don't know the full story of how we ended up here at Casa Esperanza for our wedding. But there's something about this place that's significant to my family, and I think it's important you all understand it. I walked to the front of the terrace where a small screen had been set up for the slideshow. I told everyone was coming tomorrow. But instead of wedding photos, I pulled up a single image I'd had professionally photographed and enlarged. It was the brochure, that yellowed, curling piece of paper that had lived on my parents' refrigerator for 25 years. The image on the screen showed it in brutal detail, the faded colours, the curling corners, the grease stains from decades of kitchen exposure, the ancient piece of yellowed tape barely holding it to the surface behind it. And, in cheerful script across the top, Casa Esperanza, where dreams find home. This brochure, I said, looking directly at my mother, was pinned to our kitchen refrigerator for as long as I can remember. My mother would point to it and say, someday, when we're successful, we'll go to Casa Esperanza. It became this family mantra. Someday, when we make it. When we finally become the people we're supposed to be. My mother's face had gone very still. My father was looking at his dessert plate like it held the secrets of the universe. The thing is, I continued, someday never came for them. The brochure yellowed and curled and faded until it was more brown than white, but it stayed pinned there year after year. A monument to dreams that never turned into reality. I paused, letting that settle. But here's what my parents don't know. Here's what I haven't told anyone until this moment. I looked around the terrace at the confused, curious faces of my guests. Mark was watching me with pride and a little concern, not sure where I was going, but trusting me to get there. Someday did arrive, just not for them. I turned back to the screen to that faded brochure. Last year, when this property came up for sale, I bought it. Casa Esperanza doesn't belong to a faceless corporation or some distant investor. It belongs to me. My name is on the deed. The dream my parents talked about for 25 years but never achieved, I achieved it, and we're standing in it right now. The silence on the terrace was absolute. Even the ocean seemed to quiet. So, Mom, Dad, welcome to Casa Esperanza. Welcome to the place you spent a quarter century dreaming about but never quite managed to reach. I met my mother's eyes across the space between us. Welcome to my house. My mother was staring at the screen with an expression I'd never seen before. Horror, recognition, and something that might have been grief, all mixed together. The faded brochure on the screen was like a mirror held up to her face, showing her exactly how much time she'd spent dreaming and how little she'd spent doing. Lisa had gone pale, her mouth slightly open. Mark started clapping first, then his parents joined in, then the rest of the guests, until the entire terrace was applauding. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my mother, watching her stare at that image of her own abandoned dream, understanding finally hitting her that the daughter she'd dismissed, The daughter she tried to keep small and silent and trapped had achieved what she never could. She stared at that faded brochure like a ghost from her past. Her abandoned dream was staring back, owned by the daughter she'd abandoned. Watching my mother stare at her abandoned dream should have felt triumphant, but mostly I felt tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from finally putting down weight you've carried for decades. The rehearsal dinner wound down quickly after my announcement. Mark's mother hugged me and whispered, "I'm proud of you," and my friends circled protectively, glad to see me finally tell my story out loud. My parents left without saying goodbye. I watched them walk through the lobby, my mother's back rigid, my father's hand on her elbow trying to steady her. Lisa lingered longer, finishing her wine and watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she too disappeared. Mark waited until most guests had drifted off before approaching me at the terrace railing. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside me, his shoulder touching mine. "That was brave," he finally said. "That was necessary. Tomorrow's going to be harder." "I know, which is why I want to give you something tonight." He pulled a flat package from his jacket wrapped in brown paper, roughly 8 by 10 inches. "This isn't a wedding gift. This is something else. Open it." I untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was a photograph in a simple wooden frame, and for a moment I thought it was the Christmas photo from 1995. But this photo was whole. It showed 10-year-old me in my red velvet dress standing in front of the Christmas tree, my smile wide and genuine. Not half a smile, all of me, centered in the frame, complete and uncut. Lisa was there too, off to one side, but the composition was about me. My parents stood behind us, slightly blurred. "I don't understand. This photo doesn't exist. My mother cut it." It didn't exist, but I had it recreated. There's a specialist in New York who does photo restoration. I gave her the torn half you've carried and other photos from that time. She reconstructed what was cut away and recentered the composition around you. I stared at myself whole and complete. "But this isn't exactly what the original looked like." "No, the original was about Lisa. This version is about you. This is what that photo should have been if it had been taken by someone who actually saw you." My vision blurred with tears. I'd cried so rarely in my adult life that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like. But holding this impossible photograph, this gift of wholeness from someone who'd looked at my brokenness and decided to reconstruct it, I couldn't hold back. "You were never half a person, Tara." Mark's voice was gentle but firm. "They just couldn't fit you in their small frame, so they cut you out rather than getting a bigger frame. The problem was never your size. It was always the frame." I set the photograph down carefully because my hands were shaking. Then I turned to Mark and cried against his chest, his arms holding me steady while I finally let go of something I'd been gripping for 22 years. These weren't tears of pain, though there was pain in them. They were tears of recognition of being seen so completely that all my defences became unnecessary. Mark had taken the symbol of my erasure and transformed it into proof of my wholeness. I carried that torn photo every day for 22 years. I said when I could speak. "As a reminder." "I know, and now you don't have to carry it anymore. You can carry this instead." He wiped tears from my cheeks. "You can carry the truth that you were always whole, always enough, always worthy of being seen." I picked up the photograph again, studying it in the soft light. That 10-year-old face looked back at me, captured in unguarded joy before she learned that joy needed apologising for. I wanted to reach through time and tell her what I knew, now that the cutting wasn't about her inadequacy, but about their inability to see beyond their own limitations. "Thank you. This is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me." You deserve thoughtfulness. You deserve people who see you fully and choose you because of who you are. He tucked hair behind my ear. Tomorrow, you're going to face them again. They're going to try to make it about them to diminish what you've built. But remember this photo. Remember that you're whole regardless of whether they can see it. I will. I looked at the photograph, then at him. How did you know this was what I needed? Because I know you, I see you, and I've seen you carrying that torn photo like penance for something that was never your fault. He took my hand. Tomorrow's going to be hard. Your mother is planning something. But tonight, let yourself rest. Let yourself be whole and seen and enough. Fighting. We stood looking out at the ocean with the restored photograph between us. The tradition was separate rooms tonight, that I wouldn't see him until I walked down the aisle tomorrow. It felt cruel suddenly, but the separation was temporary. What came after would be permanent. Tomorrow, I would marry this man who had looked at broken pieces and seen wholeness. Tomorrow, I would stand before my family and everyone else and claim my space without apology. Tomorrow, I would prove that visibility wasn't something they could grant or withhold. It was something I could claim for myself. Tomorrow, I would stop hiding. Tonight, I let myself be held by someone who'd always seen me whole. Being held by someone who saw me whole gave me the strength to face a day designed to prove I never needed their approval in the first place. I woke the morning of my wedding with sunlight streaming through the windows and a clarity I'd never felt before a major life event. No anxiety, no second-guessing, just readiness. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m, when the light would be golden and the heat less intense. Carmen and her team had transformed the terrace into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. White chairs arranged in neat rows and arch, covered in white roses, and trailing greenery lanterns waiting to be lit as the sun set. The Pacific stretched out behind it all, that endless blue-green expanse that had witnessed countless beginnings and endings. 200 guests filled those white chairs. Mark's family took up several rows, warm and welcoming people who'd embraced me without hesitation. My colleagues from ME Resorts, including Robert, who'd become something of a mentor. Friends from different chapters of my life, people who'd seen me at various stages of becoming. And in the back, where I deliberately seated them, my parents and Lisa. I watched from the window of my suite as guests arrived, saw my mother's face when she realised where she'd been placed. Not in the front row where mothers of the bride traditionally sat, but in the 8th row, surrounded by Mark's extended family and my college friends. She'd looked around as if expecting someone to correct the obvious mistake, but no one had, because it wasn't a mistake. When the music started and I walked down that aisle on the arm of Robert, who I'd asked to do the honour since my father had never stood up for me when it mattered I didn't look at my parents. I looked at Mark standing at the altar with tears already in his eyes, looking at me like I was the only person in the world. And for those 20 steps, I was whole and seen and enough. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. We'd written our own vows, and when I promised to see Mark fully, to never make him small for my comfort, to build a family based on choice rather than obligation, I felt my mother shift in her seat behind me. When Mark promised to remind me daily that I was never half of anything, that I was complete, exactly as I was, I heard someone near the back start crying. Not my mother. One of Mark's aunts who'd heard enough of my story to understand what those words meant. We were pronounced married. We kissed while 200 people applauded. We walked back down that aisle together, and this time I did look at my parents. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother's face was rigid with something I couldn't quite name. Lisa was on her phone. The reception flowed seamlessly from ceremony. The terrace was rearranged tables, set up food served. Speeches began after dinner, the traditional toasts that marked these occasions. Mark's father went first, telling a story about Mark as a boy that had everyone laughing. My college roommate went next, sharing how I'd helped her through her parents' divorce, how I'd been the steady one, the one who knew how to survive family dysfunction. Then, Mark's best man stood raising his glass, and I saw my mother move. She didn't stand immediately. She waited until he was mid-sentence, waited until there was a natural pause where he took a breath. Then she was on her feet, walking toward where the microphone had been set up near the head table, her hand already reaching for it. The best man, confused, stepped back. Mark's hand tightened on mine under the table. Carmen, stationed near the sound system, as I'd requested, looked at me with a question in her eyes. I gave the smallest shake of my head. Let it happen. My mother took the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd never been denied a platform. She smoothed her dress, arranged her face into an expression of wounded dignity, and began to speak. I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to say. Something I think everyone here should know. Her voice carried across the terrace, amplified and clear. This wedding has been very difficult for our family. Very difficult. You see, we've been planning a vacation for years. 25 years, in fact. We've saved and dreamed and planned, and we finally booked it. Casa Esperanza, March 10th through the 20th. She paused for effect, looking around at the confused faces of guests who didn't yet understand where this was going. But then Tara decided to have her wedding on March 15th, right in the middle of our vacation, even though she knew we had plans, even though we told her. My mother's voice took on that martyred quality I knew so well. She could have picked any other date, any other weekend, but she chose this one, and when we asked her to please consider changing it, she refused. She said her date was more important than our vacation. I watched guests shifting, uncomfortably glancing at each other. Some who knew me well enough were starting to look angry on my behalf. Others who didn't know the history just looked confused. So we had to cancel our dream vacation to come to this wedding. We sacrificed what we'd been planning for decades because Tara couldn't be bothered to show us any consideration. She shook her head sadly. It's always been this way with her. Selfish, thinking only of herself. Never mind how her choices affect the people who raised her, who sacrificed for her, who gave up so much. The silence on that terrace was absolute. Even the ocean seemed to quiet. Then Lisa stood up from her table, and I realized this had been choreographed. They'd planned this together, scripted it, rehearsed it. Lisa walked to stand beside our mother, a show of unified family, against the selfish daughter. Classic Tara, Lisa said loud enough for everyone to hear, even without the microphone. Always playing the victim, always making everything about her. She looked around at the guests with a practiced expression of long-suffering patience. We've dealt with this behaviour our whole lives. We've tried to be patient, tried to be understanding. But at some point, people need to know the truth about who she really is. The silence stretched. I could feel Mark preparing to stand to defend me, but I put my hand on his arm. Not yet. Let them finish. Let them show everyone exactly who they are, without interruption, without excuse, without anyone able to claim later that I provoked them or took their words out of context. 200 witnesses watched my mother and sister stand at my wedding reception and call me selfish for getting married on the date I'd chosen. 200 people heard them claim victimhood because their vacation plans conflicted with my wedding. 200 guests sat in stunned silence as my family tried to humiliate me on what should have been the happiest day of my life. I stood perfectly still, let the silence wrap around their words like a noose. Then I smiled and walked to the microphone. Walking to the microphone felt like moving through water. Everything slowed down and crystalline. I could see each face in the crowd, the confusion and discomfort and anger on behalf of me, from people who knew me, the uncertainty from those who didn't. My mother was still standing near the head table, holding her position like she'd won something. Lisa had that smug expression she always got when she thought she had successfully put me in my place. My father, predictably, was staring at his hands. I took the microphone from my mother. She resisted for a fraction of a second, then let go, probably thinking I was going to apologize or make excuses or break down crying. I'd done all those things before, when confronted with her public criticisms, but not today. "Thank you, Mum," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I appreciate you sharing your perspective, and you're absolutely right about one thing. This is Casa Esperanza, the place you've been dreaming about for 25 years, the vacation you've been planning." I paused, looked directly at her. "So let me fill in the parts of the story you left out." I turned to address the full room, making sure my voice reached every corner of the terrace. My mother is correct that she's been planning to come to Casa Esperanza for 25 years. She kept a brochure of this place on our refrigerator my entire childhood. "Someday, when we're successful," she'd say. "Someday, when we make it." I let that hang in the air for a moment. But what my mother didn't mention is that I told her about my wedding date 8 months ago. March 15th, I gave her 8 months' notice, and in all that time she never mentioned having conflicting vacation plans, not once. My mother's face was starting to shift from righteous anger to something that looked like dawning awareness that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. "But here's what's really interesting," I continued. "My mother said she had to cancel her dream vacation to come to my wedding, except she never actually booked a vacation here. I know this because I own Casa Esperanza. I bought it last year. This resort, this building, this terrace we're standing on, it's mine." The collective intake of breath from 200 guests was audible. My mother's face went completely white. So when my mother called out Casa Esperanza a few months ago, claiming to be the mother of the bride and trying to update my booking, trying to manipulate my staff into giving her control over my wedding venue, I was notified immediately. Because I'm not just the bride, I'm the owner. I kept my tone conversational factual like I was discussing the weather. And when she couldn't manipulate her way into cancelling my wedding, she tried to book herself a room during my wedding week. She was denied. Not because we were full, but because I specifically flagged her name in the system as someone who was not permitted to make reservations without my explicit approval. Lisa's smug expression had evaporated. She was staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. My mother mentioned the owner's suite, earlier the one she demanded be given to her for free when she arrived yesterday. I looked at her again. "That's my bedroom, Mum. You demanded free access to my personal living space. My staff denied the request as I'd instructed them to." I could see some guests starting to smile, now understanding where this was going. Mark's mother had her hand over her mouth. Robert was shaking his head in what looked like admiration. "But let's talk about that upgrade you mentioned, the one you claimed you couldn't afford because I was being so selfish with my wedding timing. I actually did upgrade your room, Mum. I personally authorised it. Moved you from a standard room to a junior suite. Waived the $300 price difference." I paused. "You're welcome." My mother tried to speak, but nothing came out. She looked like someone who'd just realised she was standing on a trapdoor and the floor was about to drop. "Now, let's address the real issue here. You said you've sacrificed so much for me, that you've given up so much, and you have given up something. You've given up the truth." I pulled my phone from my clutch and pulled up the bank records I'd prepared. "For the past 6 years, your mortgage has been paid by an anonymous LLC. You thought it was autopay from Dad's pension, didn't you? You never questioned where the $2,500 came from every single month, right on time, never late, never missed." My father's head snapped up his face, showing something I'd never seen before. Genuine shock. "That was me. I've been paying your mortgage since I was 26 years old. Through an anonymous limited liability company I set up specifically for that purpose. 6 years, 72 payments, $180,000. I let those numbers sink in. The invisible daughter, the selfish one, the one who supposedly never thinks of anyone but herself. I kept you housed. I kept you from foreclosure. I did it silently because I knew if you knew it was me, you'd find a way to resent me for it, or make it somehow my fault that you needed help. The silence on that terrace was different now. It wasn't shock or discomfort, it was witnessing. 200 people were watching my mother's narrative collapse under the weight of documented truth. So yes, Mum, I chose March 15th for my wedding. I chose it 8 months in advance and told you immediately. I chose to get married at the resort I own, the one you dreamed about but never achieved. I chose to invite you even though you've spent my entire life making me feel invisible. And I chose to pay your mortgage for 6 years without telling you because despite everything, I didn't want you to lose your home. My voice didn't waver, didn't rise, stayed perfectly calm. The only thing selfish about this wedding is standing here and calling me selfish in front of 200 people who now know exactly who's been supporting whom. Someone started clapping. One person at first, then another, then suddenly the entire terrace erupted. People were standing applauding, some wiping tears, others looking at my mother and Lisa with expressions of disgust or pity. The sound built and built until it was almost deafening, and I just stood there holding the microphone, watching my mother's face, as everything she'd tried to do to me inverted completely. She'd wanted to humiliate me. Instead, she'd given me the perfect platform to tell the truth. Lisa had sunk back into her chair, her phone forgotten on the table. My father was crying openly, his face in his hands. And my mother just stood there frozen, unable to move or speak or do anything but absorb the fact that her invisible daughter had just become the most visible person in the room. The applause shook the room. But I had one more thing to say. Having one more thing to say felt like holding the last card in a game I'd been forced to play my entire life. I waited for the applause to die down, holding up one hand until the terrace grew quiet. "Mom! Dad, could you come up here, please?" They approached like prisoners approaching sentencing. When they reached me, I pulled an envelope from my clutch, cream-coloured with their names in calligraphy. "This is my wedding gift to you. 1 week all-inclusive at Casa Esperanza. Any week you choose in the next year. The vacation you've been dreaming about for 25 years. My mother stared at the envelope. My father's hand trembled reaching for it. "But there's a condition. Inside is a list of 47 staff members. Some work here. Some worked here 30 years ago when you were rude to them. Others work at places where I've quietly apologised for your behaviour." I kept my voice steady. "Before you can use this gift, you need to write a personal handwritten thank you note to each person on that list, acknowledging them, seeing them." "Tara, that's," my mother started. "Non-negotiable. You don't have to apologise, though that would be appropriate. You just have to acknowledge them as people, thank them, see them." I paused, because maybe if you practice seeing other people, you'll eventually learn how to see me. My father took the envelope with both hands. "Tara, I didn't know about the mortgage." "I know you didn't, Dad. That's why you need to start paying attention. Stop letting Mum make all the decisions. Stop checking out when things get uncomfortable." I looked at both of them. "I'm giving you a gift and homework. Do the work or don't, but you don't get the reward without the accountability." My mother's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward, with her arms out. I stepped back. "Not yet. You don't get to hug me and make this okay without doing the work first. You earn your way back into my life or you don't come back at all. But either way, I'm done making myself small so you can feel big." My mother's hands dropped. My father put the envelope carefully in his pocket. "We'll do it, all 47. Good." I turned back to the microphone. "I'm sorry for the interruption, everyone. Let's get back to celebrating." The guests erupted again. My parents returned to their table, both moving like they'd aged a decade. Mark came to my side, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." The reception continued. Music, dancing, joy. Throughout the evening, guests approached me, some to congratulate, some to share their own difficult family stories, some just to hug me. One woman, a colleague of Mark's mother, pulled me aside near the bar. "You should have thrown them out. That's what they deserved." I considered her words. Maybe, but throwing them out would have been about making them suffer. What I did was about making them see. There's a difference. What difference? Revenge would be humiliation for its own sake. Justice is making them see what they lost and giving them a chance to change. I took a sip of water. I can't control whether they take that chance, but I can control whether I offered it. I did this to free myself, not to chain them to guilt. What if they don't change? What if they take the vacation and never write those notes? Then that's their loss, not mine. I'll know I gave them a path back to me. If they don't take it, I'll have my answer about whether they're capable of change. I looked at my parents sitting quietly. But either way, I'm not waiting for their approval anymore. I'm not measuring my worth by their inability to see it. That was the trap I lived in for 32 years. I'm out now. She nodded, smiled. You're stronger than I would have been. I'm strong enough to be kind without being destroyed by it. That's the difference between me and them. She squeezed my hand and left. I stood watching the reception unfold. My wedding, my venue, my terms, and in the middle of it all I'd held on to something my family tried to take, my humanity. I hadn't become cruel in response to their cruelty. I'd become clear about my boundaries while remaining open to their redemption. Grace offered accountability required. That was the line between us. I started back to Mark when I saw Lisa stand from her table. She wasn't heading for the exit. She was heading for a quiet corner phone, out her face twisted with desperation and fury. I remembered Carmen's warnings about suspicious activity, about someone trying to access the booking system remotely, about attempted breaches it had flagged. But Lisa, drowning in her sister's triumph, had one desperate card left to play. Watching Lisa play that desperate card meant following her when she slipped away from the reception down the path that led to the beach below the resort. I told Mark I needed a few minutes and walked carefully in my wedding dress, holding up the hem to keep it from dragging in the sand. The sun had set an hour ago and the beach was lit only by moonlight and the distant glow from the resort terrace above. I found her sitting on the sand near the water's edge, her shoes abandoned beside her, her carefully styled hair coming loose in the ocean breeze. Even from a distance, I could see her shoulders shaking. As I got closer, I realised she was crying. Not the delicate tears she'd perfected for sympathy, but the kind of crying that came from somewhere deep and ugly, the kind that destroyed makeup and left you gasping. I stopped a few feet away, not sure if I should speak or just leave her there. But she must have heard me because she looked up and, in the moonlight, I saw her face was a mess of mascara and tears, and something that looked like absolute devastation. "Come to gloat," she said, her voice raw and hoarse. "I came to make sure you weren't planning anything else." I kept my tone neutral. "Were you—" She laughed, but it was bitter and broken. "What else could I possibly do? You already destroyed me up there. Everyone saw. Everyone knows." She wiped at her face, smearing makeup further. "You won. Congratulations. This wasn't about winning Lisa. Wasn't it? You stood up there and told 200 people that you own the resort, that you paid Mum and Dad's mortgage, that you're successful and generous and perfect, while the rest of us are just pathetic failures." She picked up a handful of sand and let it run through her fingers. "You wanted them to see you. Well, they saw you, and now they see me too. The jealous sister who tried to sabotage her own sister's wedding. The villain of your redemption story." I sat down in the sand beside her, not caring any more about my dress. "Why did you do it? The private investigator, the emails to Robert trying to hijack the venue, the speech you wrote for Mum. Why go to all that effort?" "Because I'm drowning," she said simply. "And you're not, and I couldn't stand it." "Drowning in what?" She was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "David left me 2 years ago, my husband. He cleaned out our bank accounts, maxed out our credit cards, and left me with $200,000 in debt from his failed business ventures. I came home to an empty house and a note saying he'd met someone else. She pulled her knees up to her chest. I haven't told Mum and Dad. They think David and I are just taking some space while he works on a project out of state. Because if I told them the truth, I'd have to admit that perfect Lisa Golden child Lisa, the one who was supposed to be delicate and protected, failed at her marriage. Failed at everything. I processed this information, trying to reconcile it with the woman who'd been so cruel to me for so long. I'm sorry that happened to you. Are you? Because I wouldn't be if it were you. She laughed again, that same broken sound. That's the difference between us. You're actually sorry. You actually mean it. Even after everything I've done to you. Why did you do it, Lisa? Really? Was it just about the debt? No, the debt was just the trigger. The truth is simpler and so much worse. She turned to look at me, her eyes red and swollen. I sabotaged you because I needed Mum and Dad to keep seeing me as perfect while I was falling apart. If they were busy criticizing you, they wouldn't look too closely at me. If you were the problem child, I could stay the golden one even while my life was disintegrating. So you made me your shield. Yes, and before that, I made you my servant. I let Mum keep you home instead of going to MIT because I didn't want to deal with Grandma. I let them treat you like you were worthless because it meant I stayed valuable. She dug her fingers into the sand. And the worst part is that you were always better than me. At everything. You were smarter, harder working, more genuinely kind. If Mum and Dad had actually paid attention, they would have seen that. So I made sure they never looked at you long enough to notice. The confession hung in the air between us, salt and truth and the sound of waves. I'd spent my whole life wanting to hear Lisa admit she'd been cruel, wanting acknowledgement that the favoritism wasn't because I deserved less, but because she deliberately positioned herself to get more. And now that I had it, I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. I just felt tired. You hired the private investigator to find out how successful I was, I said. Yes, because Mama mentioned you were getting married, and I thought, how is Tara affording a wedding when she barely scrapes by? So I paid someone to look into your life. And when he came back with the report, CFO, multiple properties, investment portfolio, I wanted to throw up. She looked at me with something that might have been envy, or admiration, or both. You did it. You escaped and built something real. And I couldn't stand that you won without them ever seeing you win. It felt like cheating, somehow. Like you'd gotten away with being successful behind their backs. So you decided to expose me? No. I decided to destroy you before they could be proud of you. Before they could realize they'd been wrong about you all along. Because if they realized that, they might realize they'd been wrong about me too. That the golden child wasn't actually golden, that I'd just been better at performing. I sat with that for a moment, understanding clicking into place. Lisa's cruelty hadn't been random or just about jealousy. It had been strategic self-preservation. She'd kept me down to keep herself up, had made me invisible so she could stay visible. And now that I'd made myself impossible to ignore, her whole structure had collapsed. I'm sorry, she whispered, for all of it, for MIT, for Grandma, for every time I let them make you small so I could stay big, for the emails and the investigator and the speech, for spending your whole life treating you like you were less than me when the truth is, I've always known you were more. I've spent my entire life hating you for simply existing, for being what I pretended to be. She asked if I'd help her. She was looking at me with desperate hope, like I might be her lifeline the way she'd always used me as her shield. And I looked at the sister who'd tried to erase me for 32 years and said, give me one reason why. Giving her one reason why turned out to be a question she couldn't answer on the beach that night. She'd sat there in the sand, crying and broken, and finally just shook her head and said, I can't. There's no good reason. I don't deserve your help. I'd left her there and returned to my reception to Mark and dancing and joy, and the next morning we'd flown to Bali for our honeymoon. 7 days of beaches and temples, and Mark reminding me hourly that I was remarkable. 7 days of not thinking about my family or what came next. We'd been back in Chicago for 3 days when my phone started blowing up. It was a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk at ME Resorts reviewing quarterly projections when the first text came through. Then another, then 5 more in rapid succession, all from different people, all saying variations of the same thing. Have you seen what your sister posted? And are you okay? And this is insane. Do you want me to respond? I opened Facebook, something I rarely did anymore, and found myself tagged in a post from Lisa's account. The post had been up for 3 hours and already had over 200 comments and had been shared 47 times. It was long, emotional, and completely fabricated. I need to tell the truth about my sister, it began. Tara has always been jealous of our family, of the love and support we tried to give her. Growing up, she was difficult and resentful, always claiming she was being treated unfairly, when really, she just didn't want to help the family during hard times. When our grandmother was dying, we begged Tara to help care for her, but she resented every moment made everyone miserable and has held it against us ever since. I read with a strange detachment, like I was reading about someone else's life. The post went on to describe how I'd stolen the family's dream of visiting Casa Esperanza by secretly buying it, how I'd ambushed them at my wedding by publicly humiliating them, how I'd manipulated the narrative to make myself look like a victim, when really I was a calculating person who spent years plotting revenge against a family that only ever tried to love her. The comments were mixed. Some people who didn't know me were sympathetic to Lisa. Wow, your sister sounds toxic, and family is everything. I'm sorry she treated you this way. And some people can't let go of the past. But there were also comments from people demanding more information, asking questions, pointing out inconsistencies in her story. I took a screenshot of the post and was about to call Mark when I noticed the comments had started shifting. Someone I didn't recognise had written, "This doesn't add up. I was at the wedding. The mother admitted they'd been planning to go to the resort the same week as the wedding. How is that the bride's fault?" Then another comment, this one from Jenna, my colleague, from years ago. "I've known Tara for 8 years. This characterisation is completely false, and I have questions about why you're posting this publicly instead of handling it privately." Then Robert, my CEO, posted, "I've worked with Tara Sanders for 4 years. She is one of the most professional, ethical, and kind people I know. I'm deeply troubled by this post and the motivations behind it." And then someone I'd gone to college with posted a comment with an attachment. "Since we're sharing things publicly, here's the mighty acceptance letter with full scholarship that Tara's mother hid from her and never submitted. Maybe before we judge who's the villain in this story, we should know the full context." The thread exploded. More people started posting, some defending me, some attacking Lisa, some demanding evidence, and my friends delivered. Screenshots of the forged debt collector emails Lisa had sent to Robert, documentation of the venue hijack attempt, bank statements showing the 6 years of mortgage payments with dates and amounts. One of Mark's cousins even posted a video she'd taken at the wedding of my mother's speech and my calm, factual response. I watched in real time as the narrative flipped. Comments that had been sympathetic to Lisa were now being challenged. "Wait, she paid their mortgage for 6 years, someone wrote. "And they called her selfish. What is wrong with these people?" Another comment, "Let me get this straight. The parents kept a brochure of this resort for 25 years, but never went. The daughter bought it and got married there. The parents tried to crash the wedding and claim it was ruining their vacation. And now the sister is on Facebook calling the daughter toxic. I don't think so." More comments piled on. This is textbook narcissistic family dynamics. The scapegoat child becomes successful, and the golden child can't handle it. And Imagine being so entitled that you think your sister buying a resort with her own money is stealing your dream, like she achieved the dream you gave up on. I sat at my desk watching the internet do what the internet does, take a story and dissect it from every angle, demanding receipts, calling out inconsistencies, refusing to accept a one-sided narrative. Within 2 hours, the post had over 1,000 comments, and at least 70% of them were defending me or calling out Lisa's behaviour. Then, Mark's mother commented, and her words were surgical. I was at this wedding. I watched Tara's mother publicly humiliate her during the reception. I watched Tara respond with grace and facts. I watched her offer her parents a gift despite their cruelty. This post is a continuation of the same pattern of abuse Tara has endured her entire life, and I will not stay silent while someone tries to rewrite history. Tara Sanders is a woman of integrity, kindness, and strength. This post says everything about its author and nothing about its subject. The final nail came when someone found and shared the old text message from Lisa. Thank God, Mum made her stay. I couldn't deal with Grandma. That had apparently been screenshot and was circulating in a local Ohio Facebook group. Someone who'd gone to high school with us had saved it years ago and now posted it with the caption, "Since Lisa Sanders wants to talk about family dynamics publicly, here's a text she sent admitting her mother deliberately trapped Tara at home. Receipts matter." I watched the comments roll in. This is disgusting. The sister is projecting her own toxicity. Imagine trying to destroy someone's reputation and having it backfire this spectacularly. By hour 4, the tide had completely turned. Every new comment was either defending me or condemning Lisa. Some were sharing the story in other groups. A few local news outlets had even picked it up. Ohio woman's wedding speech goes viral after family drama exposed. By hour 6, the post was gone. Lisa had deleted it. Then her entire Facebook account disappeared. She deactivated everything, erased her digital footprint, tried to make the evidence vanish. But the internet doesn't work that way. People had screenshots. The story had spread beyond her control. Articles had been written. The narrative was set, and it wasn't the one she'd tried to create. My phone rang. It was Mark. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." I leaned back in my chair, feeling something that might have been relief or vindication or just exhaustion. "She tried one last time to destroy me, and it didn't work." "Your friends showed up," he said. "Everyone who knows you stood up and told the truth." They did. I looked at my computer screen at the hundreds of comments from people I knew and people I'd never met, all refusing to let Lisa's lies stand unchallenged. She wanted to control the narrative. She wanted to be the victim and make me the villain. But she forgot that I've been documenting everything for 15 years. And she forgot that truth has a way of defending itself when you give it enough light. She wanted to destroy my reputation. Instead, she revealed her own character. And the internet keeps receipts forever. The internet keeping receipts forever meant Lisa had nowhere left to hide, and maybe that was what finally made her ready to listen. She texted me 2 days after the Facebook disaster. Just 3 words, "Can we talk?" I'd made her wait another day while I figured out what I wanted to say, what I was willing to offer, and what my boundaries were. Then I'd driven to Ohio. We met at a coffee shop near her apartment, the kind of generic place with uncomfortable chairs and overpriced lattes where nobody paid attention to anyone else's conversations. Lisa was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup she clearly hadn't touched. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just gotten bigger. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup-wearing jeans and a sweatshirt that had seen better days. This wasn't the Lisa who'd performed perfection my entire life. This was someone who'd run out of masks. I sat down across from her without ordering anything. "You wanted to talk?" I wanted to apologise. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the confident edge it usually carried. "For the Facebook post, for everything. I shouldn't have done it. Any of it. You're right. You shouldn't have. I kept my tone neutral, not warm, but not cruel. But apologies without changed behaviour are just words. So before we go any further, I need to know, are you actually willing to do the work to change? Or are you just sorry you got caught? She flinched but didn't look away. I don't know how to change. I've been performing for so long. I don't know who I am without the performance. Then maybe it's time to find out. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my bag and set it on the table between us. You asked me on the beach to give you one reason why I should help you. You couldn't, so I'm going to give you something different. I'm going to give you 3 chances to prove you want to change. She looked at the paper but didn't touch it. I'll help you with your debt, I said. Not all of it, because that would just be enabling you. But I'll help with a significant portion if, and only if, you complete 3 conditions. Non-negotiable. You do all 3 or you get nothing. What are the conditions? First, you write a personal handwritten apology letter to every single person who attended my wedding. All 200 of them. Not a form letter, personalised. Acknowledging what you did, taking responsibility, not making excuses or blaming anyone else. You mail them within the next month. She swallowed hard. That's a lot of letters. That's a lot of people you tried to convince that I was a villain. You wanted to perform publicly. Now you get to apologise publicly. 1 letter at a time. I paused. Second condition. You work at Casa Esperanza for 3 months, unpaid. You'll live in staff housing work in housekeeping and food service, learn what it actually means to serve people instead of being served. You'll report to Carmen, my general manager, and if she says you're not putting in real effort, you're done. 3 months. 3 months of understanding what it's like to be invisible, to do work nobody notices or appreciates, to serve people who don't see you as fully human. Maybe then, you'll understand what you put me through for 32 years. I leaned forward slightly. And third condition, the most important one. You tell Mom and Dad the truth, all of it. The debt, David leaving, why you really moved back home. You stop performing perfection and you let them see you're human. You stop using me as your shield. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. They'll be so disappointed. Maybe, or maybe they'll surprise you. Or maybe their disappointment will teach you that their approval isn't worth destroying yourself to maintain. I softened my voice slightly. Lisa, you've spent your whole life being what they wanted instead of who you are. And you've spent my whole life making me pay for the freedom you didn't have the courage to take. It has to stop. And it stops with you telling the truth. What if I do all this and you still don't help with the debt? I will help if you complete the conditions. I'm not setting you up to fail. But I need to see real effort, real change, real accountability. Not performance, not manipulation, not you going through the motions while resenting me for making you do it. I pushed the paper toward her. This is everything in writing. The conditions, the timeline, what help looks like if you succeed. Read it, think about it. Decide if you're willing to do the work. She unfolded the paper with shaking hands and read through it slowly. I watched her face cycle through emotions, resistance, fear, anger, resignation, something that might have been hope. Why are you doing this? She finally asked. After everything I've done to you, why would you offer to help at all? Because I'm giving you what I never got. I never got a chance to fail and still be loved. I never got accountability that came with support. I never got someone who believed I could change and gave me a path to do it. I met her eyes. I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because this is who I choose to be. Someone who breaks cycles instead of continuing them. Someone who offers redemption without enabling. Someone who holds people accountable while still believing they're capable of better. What if I can't do it? What if I fail? Then you fail, and you'll know you tried, and I'll know I gave you every opportunity. But the failure will be yours, not mine. I won't carry that for you anymore. Lisa was crying openly now, tears dropping onto the paper in her hands. I've been so terrible to you. Yes, you have. And now you have a choice about who you want to be going forward. You can keep being that person, or you can do the hard work of becoming someone different. I stood up, preparing to leave. You have 1 week to decide. Email me either way. If you say yes, we'll set up the timeline for the letters and I'll coordinate with Carmen about your start date at the resort. If you say no, that's your choice too, but don't contact me again. Tara. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. Thank you for not writing me off completely. I'm not writing you off, but I'm also not going to save you. You have to save yourself. I'm just offering tools if you're brave enough to use them. I left her there with the paper and her tears and her choice. Driving back to Chicago, I felt something settle in my chest. I'd done what I could do. I'd offered grace with accountability support, with boundaries, a path forward that required real effort and genuine change. Whether Lisa took it or not was entirely up to her. I gave her a choice and a path. Whether she took it wasn't mine to carry anymore. Not carrying Lisa's choices anymore meant I could finally carry my own, and the morning after my wedding, the choice I made was to leave. Mark and I had a flight to Bali in 4 hours, and I woke up in the owner's suite with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of waves outside. My wedding dress hung on the closet door, a ghost of the night before. My husband was still asleep beside me, his hand stretched across the space between us, even in sleep, always reaching for me. I got up quietly and started packing, moving through the room, gathering the things we'd need for a week away from everything. Swimsuits and sunscreen, and the book I'd been meaning to read for months. The restored photograph Mark had given me carefully wrapped in tissue paper. The torn half of the original photo which I'd decided to bring too, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. Mark woke up and watched me pack for a moment before speaking. How are you feeling? Ready, I said. Ready to leave, ready to be just us for a while, ready to stop thinking about all of this. They're going to want to talk to you before we go. I know. We finished packing together, that comfortable silence of two people who'd chosen each other completely. Carmen had arranged for our bags to be taken down separately so we could leave through the lobby without drawing attention, but I knew my parents would be waiting. They'd been given checkout information, told their room was paid through today, and that they were welcome to stay and use the resort amenities. The envelope I'd given them sat unopened on their nightstand according to the housekeeping report Carmen had discreetly shared with me. They hadn't left their room since the reception ended. We walked through the resort one last time, and I felt the weight of ownership differently now. This wasn't just a property I'd bought to prove a point. It was a place where something important had happened, where truth had been told and witnessed, where I'd finally stopped disappearing. Whatever else it became, it would always be the place where I'd chosen to be seen. My parents were waiting in the lobby, sitting on one of the couches near the front entrance. My father stood when he saw us, his face haggard like he'd aged a decade overnight. My mother stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes red, but dry. They both looked like people who'd had something fundamental shattered and were trying to figure out how to exist in the aftermath. I didn't stop walking, but I slowed down as we passed. My father opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. My mother looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Enjoy your vacation. I said, my voice neither warm nor cold, just factual. You've earned it. It could have been taken multiple ways, that statement. Earned it by completing the 47 thank you notes, which they hadn't done yet. Earned it by finally sitting with the consequences of their choices. Earned it by showing up to my wedding even after I'd revealed their failures. I didn't clarify which meaning I intended. I just kept walking Mark's hand in mine toward the car that would take us to the airport. Neither of them called after me. Neither tried to stop us or demand more conversation, or make promises they couldn't keep. They just sat there and we left. The car pulled out of the resort driveway, and I watched Casa Esperanza disappear in the rearview mirror. Mark squeezed my hand, but didn't say anything, understanding that I needed the silence to process. My phone buzzed in my bag, and I almost ignored it, but something made me check. It was a text from Carmen. "Your father came to breakfast this morning, said thank you to every single server. Please, good morning, thank you, excuse me. Every interaction. Rosa said it was the first time in all her years here that he's ever acknowledged the staff as human beings." I read the text twice, then showed it to Mark. He read it and looked at me. "That's something." "It's small," I said, "but it's something." I looked out the window at the Mexican countryside, rolling past, thinking about my father saying thank you. One tiny change in behaviour, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't witnessed decades of the opposite. It didn't erase 32 years of being made invisible. It didn't undo the MIT scholarship, or the trapped years caring for grandma, or the systematic erasure of my worth. It didn't earn forgiveness or reconciliation or even a conversation, but it was a seed, the smallest acknowledgement that maybe possibly things could be different. I thought about the envelope sitting unopened on their nightstand, the 47 names, waiting to be acknowledged. I thought about Lisa sitting in that coffee shop with 3 conditions written on paper, trying to decide if she was brave enough to choose change. I thought about Mark's mother's comment at the wedding, about how this post said everything about its author and nothing about its subject. I'd spent my whole life trying to make them see me, trying to earn their approval, trying to be enough. And then I'd finally realised that their blindness was never about my visibility. They couldn't see me because they'd never learned to see anyone beyond their own needs and narratives. And maybe now, finally, they were starting to understand what they'd missed while they weren't looking. Or maybe they'd just learned that cruelty has consequences, that the invisible daughter could become impossible to ignore, that the child they'd used and dismissed could own the dream they'd only talked about. Either way, the outcome was the same. I'd stopped waiting for their approval. I'd stopped measuring my worth by their measurements. I'd stopped making myself small to keep their peace. I'd chosen myself and Mark and the life we were building, and I'd done it. Knowing they might never change, might never apologise, might never truly see me. And I was okay with that. More than okay. I was free. Maybe people could change. Or maybe they just learned cruelty has consequences. Either way, I was finally free. Being free for 5 years taught me what peace actually felt like, and it felt nothing like the silence I'd mistaken for it my entire childhood. Real peace was waking up in a house filled with laughter, where my daughter's voice calling, "Mummy, she," wasn't followed by criticism or demands, just requests from me to create this for pancakes or help finding her favourite stuffed rabbit. Real peace was building something with Mark that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with creating something right. We'd expanded ME Resorts to include 3 properties now: Casa Esperanza in Mexico, a boutique hotel in Sedona, and a renovated historic inn in Vermont. I'd stepped back from the CFO role to focus on ownership and strategy, which meant more flexibility and more time with Emily. Mark had taken on several resort design projects, his reputation growing alongside our business. We were successful in ways I'd once only dreamed about, but more importantly, we were happy in ways I hadn't known to dream about. Emily turned 5 in September, all wild curls and endless questions, and a confidence I'd never had at her age. She knew she was loved unconditionally, knew her voice mattered, knew she could take up space without apologising for it. Watching her exist so freely in the world was its own kind of healing proof that cycles could be broken and children could be raised without the weight of parental disappointment, crushing them into acceptable shapes. Lisa had surprised me by completing all 3 conditions. She'd written 200 apology letters, worked 3 months at Casa Esperanza, where Carmen reported she'd actually tried, and she'd told our parents about David and the debt. The conversation with them had apparently been brutal, but she'd done it. I'd helped her with $40,000 toward her debt, enough to keep her from drowning, but not so much that she didn't have to work for her own recovery. She'd moved to Phoenix, worked her way up from receptionist to assistant manager at a small hotel, and we exchanged texts maybe once a month. Not close, but not enemies. She'd earned back the dignity of being able to look me in the eye. My parents were a different story. They'd completed the 47 thank you notes. Carmen confirmed it, and they had used their week at Casa Esperanza. But after that, the contact had been minimal and cautious. A Christmas card every year with a short, carefully worded message. Thinking of you during the holidays. Hope you and your family are well. Love Mum and Dad. No phone calls, no requests to visit, no demands for explanations or reconciliation. Just those annual cards that I read and put in a drawer and didn't respond to. Part of me appreciated their restraint. They were respecting my boundaries, giving me space, not pushing. But another part of me wondered if they were just waiting for me to come back to them, to make the first move toward forgiveness, to do the emotional labor of repairing what they'd broken. And I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. Emily asked about them sometimes. She had seen photos, knew she had grandparents in Ohio, and with the straightforward logic of a 5-year-old couldn't understand why they never visited. Maya's grandma comes to her house every week, she said one evening while I was tucking her into bed, and brings cookies. Why don't my grandma and grandpa visit us? I smoothed her curls back from her forehead, considering how to answer. Because I'm waiting for them to ask, not demand. What's the difference? Asking means they respect my feelings and want to know if I'm ready. Demanding means they only care about what they want. I kissed her forehead. When people hurt you, they don't automatically get access to you again just because time has passed. They have to show you they've changed, and they have to respect your boundaries while you decide if you want them back in your life. Did Grandma and Grandpa hurt you? Yes, sweetie, for a very long time. And you're not ready for them to visit yet? Not yet. Maybe someday, but maybe not. And that's okay too. She thought about this, her little face serious. Will you tell me when you're ready, because I want to meet them, but only if it's okay with you? I will absolutely tell you. I promise. I hugged her tight, grateful that she was growing up in a world where boundaries were respected, where her mother's healing mattered as much as anyone's desire for access. Mark and I had talked about whether we should facilitate some kind of relationship between Emily and my parents. But we'd agreed that forcing it would set a terrible example, would teach Emily that you had to maintain relationships with people who'd harmed you just because they were family. Better for her to see that love required respect, that access was earned, that grandparents weren't entitled to grandchildren just by virtue of biology. Besides, she had Mark's parents who adored her and flew out from San Francisco quarterly to spend time with her. She had chosen family people who showed up with love instead of criticism, with presence instead of absence. She wasn't lacking for grandparents who cared about her. I thought sometimes about my father saying thank you to the servers, about those Christmas cards, about the fact that they'd respected my boundaries for 5 years. Shiz, without pushing. Small changes sustained over time, not enough for reconciliation, but enough to show that possibly they were trying to become different people than they'd been. Or maybe they were just performing change the way they'd performed everything else, waiting for me to declare them fixed so they could go back to their old patterns. I had no way of knowing without testing it, and I wasn't ready to test it. Maybe I never would be. I'd built a good life in their absence. A whole life. A life where I woke up knowing I mattered, where my daughter would never have to carry the weight of being invisible, where my husband saw me completely and loved what he saw. I was free in ways that had nothing to do with them, and everything to do with the choices I'd made to value myself, regardless of their inability to do so. And then, on a Tuesday night in November, 5 years and 8 months after my wedding, The phone rang at midnight. I fumbled for it in the dark, Mark staring beside me. The screen said Ohio number unknown, and my stomach dropped because phone calls at midnight were never good news. Then, the phone rang at midnight with the call that would test everything I'd built inside myself. Testing everything I'd built meant facing the one thing I'd successfully avoided for 5 years, my mother's voice on the phone in the middle of the night. I answered, my hand shaking slightly, and heard something I'd never heard before in her tone. Not demand, not manipulation, genuine fear. "Tara, it's Mum. Your father had a stroke, a bad one. We're at Ohio State Medical Center and he's stable now, but the doctors say the next 48 hours are critical." Her voice cracked. "He's been asking for you. Not demanding. Asking. Please, come." I sat up in bed, Mark immediately awake beside me. "When did it happen?" 3 hours ago. He was watching television and suddenly couldn't speak. The paramedic said we got him here quickly enough that there's a chance for recovery, but it's serious, Tara. Very serious." She paused. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but he keeps trying to say your name. Please." I told her I'd be there as soon as I could and hung up. Mark was already looking at flights on his phone, and within 20 minutes, we'd arranged for me to fly out at 6 a.m. His parents would come to stay with Emily. He'd offered to come with me, but I'd said no. This was something I needed to face alone. The flight felt both endless and too short. I kept thinking about my father, about the man who'd checked out of every difficult conversation, who'd stood by, while my mother made me invisible, who'd said thank you to servers 5 years ago, like it was some monumental achievement. And now, he was in a hospital bed, possibly dying, asking for me. The hospital was exactly like every hospital. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic smell, the particular quiet of a place where people waited for news they didn't want to hear. My mother was in the ICU waiting room, looking smaller and older than I remembered. When she saw me, she stood but didn't try to hug me. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "How is he?" Awake, but struggling to speak. The left side is paralysed. They're monitoring him closely. She twisted her hands together. "You can go in. Room 412. I'll wait here." I walked down the hall alone, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. Through the window of room 412, I could see my father in the bed, looking frail in a way that shocked me. He'd always seemed so solid, so immovable in his passive presence. But lying there with tubes and monitors, his face slack on one side, he just looked like an old man who'd run out of time to say the things he should have said decades ago. I pushed open the door. His eyes tracked to me, and I saw recognition and something that looked like relief. He tried to speak, the words slurred and difficult. "Tara." "I'm here, Dad." I pulled a chair up beside the bed but didn't take his hand. "Not yet." He struggled with the words, his face contorting with effort. "I'm sorry. We made you invisible." Each word was work, but he kept going. "I see that now. I see you." It was the first time in my entire life that he'd acknowledged what they had done. Not excused it, not explained it away, not blamed it on circumstances or stress or anything else. Just clear, simple acknowledgement. They made me invisible. He saw that now. "You spent your whole life trying to be seen, and we wouldn't look." Tears were running down the side of his face that could still move. "I'm sorry." I held his hand then, not because I forgave him, not because the apology erased 32 years of erasure, but because he was dying, and he was trying, and that was more than he'd ever done before. But I didn't say, "I forgive you." The words wouldn't come, and I realised I wasn't ready to give them yet. "I hear you," I said instead. "I hear what you're saying." He closed his eyes, exhausted from the effort, and I sat there holding his hand while monitors beeped and nurses moved quietly in the hallway outside. I stayed at the hospital for 3 days while my father stabilised. The doctors said he'd survive but would need months of rehabilitation. My mother and I existed in a strange limbo of necessity, coordinating with doctors, making decisions about his care, being civil, but not warm. On the third day, I went to the hospital cafeteria for coffee and ran into Patricia Morrison, a colleague from a hospitality conference I'd attended years ago. She was visiting her own mother on a different floor. "Tara Sanders," she said warmly, "what brings you here?" I explained briefly about my father's stroke, and we sat together with terrible coffee between us. She asked how I was handling it, and I found myself being more honest than I'd planned. I don't know how to feel. He apologized, really apologized for the first time ever, but I don't know if I can forgive them. My mother, especially. The wounds are so deep. Patricia stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Can I tell you something, Mum? My father was an alcoholic. Violent, he made my childhood hell. When he got sober 20 years ago, he apologized, wanted a relationship, and I struggled with whether to forgive him." "What did you do?" "I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I'd been carrying his abuse for 30 years, letting it shape every decision I made, every relationship I had. Forgiveness didn't erase what he'd done or make us suddenly close, but it meant I stopped letting him rent space in my head." She looked at me directly. "Forgiveness is for you, Tara, not for them. It's putting down a weight you've been carrying so you can walk lighter. But doesn't forgiving them mean letting them off the hook? No, forgiveness doesn't erase their debt or say what they did was okay. It just means you're not going to keep paying interest on their mistakes for the rest of your life." She squeezed my hand. "You've been angry for 37 years. Has the anger made you free?" I thought about that. The anger had fueled me, had driven me to succeed, had kept me sharp and protected. But Patricia was right. It had also kept me tethered to them, kept me defining myself in opposition to their treatment, kept me carrying their weight alongside my own. I'd been carrying them for 32 years. Maybe it was time to put the weight down, not for them, but for me. Putting the weight down meant understanding what I'd been carrying, and that night in the hospital waiting room, my mother finally told me. We'd been sitting in silence for an hour when she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I saw myself in you, and I couldn't bear it." I looked up. "What?" She twisted her wedding ring. "I was you, Tara, the second daughter, the invisible one. My mother adored Diane, your aunt. Everything I did was compared to her and found lacking. I spent my entire childhood trying to be seen, and I never was. So you made me invisible the same way. Worse, I knew exactly how it felt, the way it hollows you out, and I did it to you anyway." She was crying. I thought making Lisa perfect would prove I wasn't a failure, but I just repeated the cycle. I chose to become my mother instead of breaking free. I stood too angry to sit. "You had a choice. Your mother made you invisible, but you didn't have to do the same to me. You could have broken the cycle. That's the difference between us, Mum. We both grew up invisible, but I chose to break the cycle. You chose to continue it." "You're right, no deflection. I had a choice at every moment. When you brought home straight A's and I criticised instead of celebrated. When MIT sent that letter and I threw it away because I couldn't bear watching you succeed where I'd failed. Every single moment I chose cruelty over courage. Why tell me this now? Because you deserve to know it wasn't about you. It was about me being too broken to see past my own damage." She faced me. "I can't undo the past. I can only ask not for forgiveness, because I don't deserve that, but for a chance to do better going forward. To be a grandmother to Emily in a way I never was a mother to you. What if I say no? Then that's my consequence. But I'm asking anyway." I looked at this woman who'd made me feel less than for 37 years and saw she'd felt the same way for 62. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained everything. She asked if I could forgive her someday. I said, I don't know yet, but I'll try. And that's more than you ever gave me. 2 years passed before I brought Emily to meet them. 2 years of supervised video calls of my mother in therapy of small steps toward change. And when Emily was 7 on a summer visit to Ohio, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Mommy, were you Grandma's favourite daughter?" We were on the porch swing, just us. I could have lied, but I'd promised myself I'd never lie about the hard things. No, sweetheart, I wasn't. Grandma's favourite was Aunt Lisa, and that hurt for a very long time. Emily's face crumpled. "But that's not fair." No, it wasn't fair, and it caused a lot of pain. She was quiet, processing. Then, "Mommy, when you have another baby, will you have a favourite me or them?" The question hit like a blow. I knelt in front of her, taking her hands, looking into her eyes. "Listen carefully, Emily. I will never, ever have a favourite. Never. You are not in competition with any sibling you might have. You're loved because you exist, not because you're better than someone else. That's my promise to you, and I will keep it every single day for the rest of my life. But what if they're better at stuff than me? Doesn't matter. Love isn't a competition. It's not something you win or lose. It's something you get just for being you." I pulled her close. "You know why I can promise you that? Because I know what it feels like to not have that promise. And I will never, ever let you feel that way." She hugged me tight. "I'm glad you're my mummy." And I thought with absolute certainty, I'm glad I'm not my mother. Inside, through the window, I could see my mother watching us, tears on her face. She'd heard me promise Emily what she'd never been able to promise me. Maybe that was its own accountability, witnessing the mother I'd become, despite her failure to model it. In that moment, watching my daughter's face relax with relief, I knew the cycle was finally broken. Breaking the cycle meant building something new in its place, and 5 years later, I stood on the beach at Casa Esperanza, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built. Emily was 12 now, confident and kind in ways I'd never been at her age. Jacob, our 3-year-old son, was building sandcastles with Mark's father while Mark's mother helped him find the perfect shells. Mark stood beside me, his hand in mine solid and present, as he'd been for the past 17 years. And further up the beach, sitting in chairs under an umbrella, were my parents. Invited. Not demanded, not tolerated, but genuinely invited after 5 years of slow, careful rebuilding. My father's left side still showed the effects of the stroke, but he'd learned to walk again, to speak clearly, to show up in ways he never had before. My mother looked older, but softer somehow, the sharp edges of her anger worn down by therapy and accountability and the daily choice to be different than she'd been. Lisa was there too, engaged now to a man who treated her like she mattered, working as a manager at a boutique hotel in Phoenix. She and I would never be close the way sisters in movies were close, but we'd found something real mutual respect built on honest acknowledgement of harm and genuine effort to change. Carmen approached me with a carefully wrapped package. It arrived this morning, perfect timing. I unwrapped the bronze plaque, running my fingers over the engraved words I'd spent weeks crafting. Then Mark and I walked down to the water's edge to the spot where I'd found Lisa crying on my wedding night 12 years ago. We'd already installed the mounting post, and together we secured the plaque facing the ocean, where anyone walking this beach would see it. The inscription read, "To those who were made invisible, you were always whole." The frame was just too small. I stood back, looking at those words, feeling something settle in my chest. This wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who'd ever been told they were too much or not enough. Everyone who'd been cut out of family photos or family narratives. Everyone who'd spent their lives trying to earn what should have been freely given. Emily came to stand beside me, reading the plaque. "That's beautiful, Mum." "Thank you, sweetheart. Can I show you something I made?" She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo she'd edited. It was the restored photograph Mark had given me all those years ago, placed side by side with the torn original. Two versions of the same moment, one showing me cut in half, the other showing me whole. "I want to frame these together," she said, "to remember what you survived and what you became. Can we do that?" I pulled her close, this daughter who would never know what it felt like to be half of anything. "Yes, we can absolutely do that." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled the sunset from my wedding night, I gathered everyone on the terrace. All of them, Mark's family, my parents, Lisa, Carmen, and the staff who'd witnessed my journey, Robert, who'd believed in me when I needed it most, even Patricia Morrison, who I'd stayed in touch with over the years. I raised my glass and everyone quieted. 12 years ago, I got married on this terrace. Some of you were there, some of you heard about it later, and some of you lived through the events that led to that moment. I looked at my parents, then at Emily and Jacob. I spent the first 32 years of my life being invisible, made small by people who should have helped me grow, and I had a choice in how to respond to that. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Revenge gave me power to stand. It gave me the strength to stop accepting mistreatment, to document the truth, to refuse to disappear anymore. And revenge had its place. I needed it to survive. I looked at my mother, who was crying quietly. But forgiveness gave me peace to breathe. Not forgiveness that erased consequences or pretended harm didn't happen, but forgiveness that let me put down weight I'd been carrying so I could walk lighter. Emily moved closer to me, and I put my arm around her. But teaching my daughter she was never half, teaching her that love isn't conditional, that worth isn't earned, that she gets to take up space just because she exists, that gave me purpose to live. Because breaking the cycle isn't just about surviving your own pain. It's about making sure the next generation never has to survive it at all. I raised my glass higher. To everyone who was made invisible and chose to become undeniable. To everyone who broke cycles instead of continuing them. To everyone who learned that their worth wasn't determined by people who couldn't see it. And to everyone here who chose love over legacy healing, over habit, and courage over comfort. To breaking cycles, Mark said, raising his glass. To breaking cycles, everyone echoed, and we drank as the sun touched the horizon. My mother approached me after her face streaked with tears. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up on us, for giving us the chance to be better." "Thank you for taking it," I replied. "Not warm, not cold, just honest." Emily tugged on my sleeve. "Mum, can we put the photographs in my room so I can see them every day?" "Of course, why?" "Because I want to remember that people can be broken and still become whole. That someone can cut you in half and you can still choose to be complete." She looked at me with those wise 12-year-old eyes. "You taught me that." Mark found us as the last light faded, pulling me and Emily both into a hug, Jacob running over to join the pile. We stood there, the four of us, while around us the people who'd hurt me and the people who'd healed me mingled on the terrace of the resort I'd built from their abandoned dream. And in that moment, surrounded by people who'd hurt me and people who'd healed me, I realised the truth. I'd stopped waiting for them to see me. I'd learnt to see myself. And that was always enough. Thank you so much for staying with me through Tara's entire journey. This story took us from a 10-year-old girl standing in front of a Christmas tree, about to be erased from her own family photo, all the way to a woman who built an empire, broke generational cycles, and finally learned that her worth was never something she needed to earn. Along the way, we explored 5 powerful truths that I hope resonated with you. First, that your feelings are always valid, even when others dismiss them. Second, that your worth is unconditional and exists simply because you exist. Third, that justice and revenge are fundamentally different, and choosing justice means holding people accountable while still offering them a path to change. Fourth, that breaking toxic cycles starts with you making different choices than the ones that hurt you. And fifth, that forgiveness is ultimately for your own peace, not for the people who hurt you. And it doesn't erase their responsibility or mean you have to let them back into your life unconditionally. Tara's story shows us that standing up for yourself doesn't make you cruel, setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish, and choosing your own healing over someone else's comfort doesn't make you the villain. She spent 32 years being made invisible, but she refused to stay that way. She documented the truth, she built something undeniable, and when the moment came to confront her family, she did it with facts and dignity rather than screaming or cruelty. That's real strength. And perhaps most importantly, she didn't wait for her family to change before she started living freely. She took her power back, built the life she deserved, and only then, from a position of strength and security, did she consider what reconciliation might look like on her terms. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the invisible child in your family? Have you experienced favoritism that made you question your worth? Or maybe you've had to set boundaries with the family members who tried to control your life or diminish your achievements. Share your story in the comments below, because your experience matters and someone else watching this video right now might need to hear that they're not alone. What would you have done in Tara's position at the wedding? Would you have revealed everything publicly like she did, or would you have handled it differently? And here's the big question. Do you think Tara made the right choice in offering her parents and Lisa a path back into her life, or should she have cut them off completely? There's no wrong answer here, and I genuinely want to know your perspective. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss future stories about resilience, justice, and breaking free from toxic patterns. Give this video a thumbs up if Tara's journey resonated with you, and consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that they were never half of anything, that they were always whole, and that the frame was just too small. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for being here, for listening to Tara's story, and for being part of this community where we celebrate people who choose healing over hatred and dignity over destruction. I'll see you in the next story, and until then, remember, you don't need anyone's permission to be whole. You already are.